The time came when some warriors became competitors among themselves. But in pursuit of good rewards, they began to do thoughtless things. But only the main character, Johnny, was able to obtain the highest level silver card. Now he was confident that he could bully all the noobs, but first he needed to get a profession. As soon as everyone starts bragging about their strength, he will be ready to improve their reputation. At first they simply laughed at him, but later all those who did this regretted it very much. Johnny knew well that everything he worked on would turn into forbidden dark spells. Feeling his superiority over the newcomers, he began to become more confident. The time came when it was necessary to enter a university with extraordinary abilities. Johnny thought it would be too easy and simple, but he was wrong. He had a beautiful teacher, Liz, around him on whom he relied. She often put him in his place and humiliated him in front of other students for his bad behavior. But despite all this, Johnny still treated her well because Liz was the best. Sometimes the hero tried to compete with her at least once, but it always ended in defeat. Many students were inspired by Liz's talent, which she acquired at the age of 16. Johnny was considered a loser because at 18 he had not yet awakened to any profession. Once all the students were ready for the exam, all the rules were announced to them. Johnny understood that this was not the first time he had been through this, and therefore Net was a newbie, but he really wanted to become a magician, since great prospects awaited him there. Learning something new was very difficult for Johnny, but despite everything, he wanted to become a magician. But hope died last, and he hoped to pass the test and end up in the testing zone. There he was met by a new teacher, Mary, who was trying to unlock his potential. It was Johnny who was the first to demonstrate his abilities. The hero, having collected his thoughts, hoped that awakening would give him basic skills. But it all ended in failure again when he received only 1 star. All the students just couldn't stop laughing. Johnny was a loser again. Subsequently, he and Miss Mary began to discuss all his abilities that had been awakened. In fact, the woman was very sorry that he had been practicing for many years, but the result was not encouraging. To help the student, she gave Johnny the initial equipment for the first level. This gave the hero all the strength and self-confidence he could muster. The system began to help Johnny, but all this was not very clear to him. All his thoughts were directed only at prohibiting the spell. But he didn't understand what they had to do with him. But he was used to fighting his fear, because he had faced such a situation before. Johnny was determined that combat trials were soon awaiting him. Having confirmed his new abilities, Johnny set them up for the new battle that was about to begin. It was clear that a large number of monsters with high abilities were waiting for all the students in the dungeon. Many participants had no idea what awaited them, but they moved forward. Johnny was very afraid that no one would notice his abilities because there could be ridicule again. As soon as the hero found himself in the forest among the green goblins, he was still afraid to use spells. The management was unhappy with the way Johnny was handling his tasks. Miss Mary, as always, stood by her student. She knew that he had health problems. Suddenly they lost contact with their drone. All radars began to notice that the activity in the area was too strong. There were an incredible number of monsters. The most important one immediately gave the order to cut down the invaders who entered their territory. Johnny didn't believe that this could happen, and didn't even understand what to do. But when the hero saw these creatures with his own eyes, he was stunned by their number. A second later, Johnny was ready to test the reality of the forbidden technique. The monsters did not expect such a turn of events at all, but this was the first time they encountered such magic. Without restoring the commander's connection, the inability to control his students was frightening. Although the hero began to cope with spells quite well and could resist his enemy, throughout the fight, the main demon was unable to move. This monster did not believe that a man could possess such power. The game continued and Johnny was still in the forest, but he was very surprised that he managed to reach level 10. It was very strange for him because no one had ever achieved such a result before him. As soon as he turned around, he realized that the remains of the monster were around him. Suddenly a message sounded that everyone had to evacuate. Danger was near, but Johnny couldn't leave this place. He needed to collect all the monster's items. Now he knew well that if he sold it, he could get very rich. All the emblems were quite original, and he had never seen anything like them before. Johnny tried to hide everything very carefully so that the other participants would not see. The system kept screaming. Johnny decided to see what was going on. Everything around his clearing was burnt out. There were giant holes everywhere. Perhaps these were the forbidden spells. The participants still did not want to ignore the system and return to base. The management was well aware that the situation was not developing in the best way. All participants had to be quickly sent to the city, and in the meantime the university had to be closed. Teacher Mary was very worried about Johnny as she understood that the approaching demon was too strong. No one knew whether reinforcements would arrive in time, and so they relied on their own strength. They tried to block some of the exits in the building, but silence was necessary to prevent panic. The commander was even surprised when he saw that Johnny had emerged from the dungeon safe and sound. Meanwhile, Johnny was already in the city and began to discuss all the events with his girlfriend. But all his thoughts were still about the fact that he was able to reincarnate already. But the testing was stopped. This depressed him greatly. Everything indicated that this incident had had a significant impact on him. The girl knew that protective spells could help a lot, but were useless for independent pumping. Johnny wanted to handle everything alone, but she persistently invited him to join her team. He really didn't understand why his friend kept ignoring him. That's why I wanted to use one of my methods and pretend that he was sick. Arriving in a new area, he knew that this was where he could get help in choosing the right weapon. Johnny wanted to find a consultant who could help him with his choice. Having bumped into an unfamiliar woman, he thought that she could help him. Before entering the building, the young man felt uncomfortable because he had little money. The woman politely began to talk about different weapons, but after a second, she no longer wanted to help. When the worker learned that he only wanted to rent his gun, she thought that he was some poor man again. But then another consultant appeared. She happily began to tell the stranger about what they had in their arsenal. But as it turned out, Johnny also wanted to sell the old weapons. And then the woman brought him to a man who bought old, unnecessary things. But before selling his weapons, he wanted to choose something new for himself. In front of his face were many new weapons that were much better than his. Approaching the worker again, he wanted to see what exactly Johnny wanted to sell. But when he noticed a rather rare weapon, he realized that he could make good money on it. It was a bit of a challenge for the boys to come up with a final figure, so he wanted to hear a man's opinion. Before declaring the final price, the worker decided to talk to one more person. And at that moment, a worker who had previously not wanted to communicate with Johnny approached them. When he came to the group, the man said that such a weapon cost about $500,000. The worker, who at first did not want to serve him, acted very cleverly because she realized that this was a good arsenal. Meanwhile, the men already wanted to draw up all the papers to sell the price of Johnny's thing. After rumors began to spread quickly throughout the company, the woman regretted not having signed up such a client. In other rooms, all the workers were discussing the man who sold the expensive weapon. The next day, the hero began to feel much better because now he had good equipment. At the university, everyone immediately started paying attention to him. At that moment, the team was fully assembled and wanted to meet Johnny. But it was Liz who wanted to introduce everyone, and as it turned out, it was her team. At first glance, the man realized that he was not very accepted in this company. But Liz decided to introduce them anyway so that they could get to know each other better. In honor of their first meeting, one of her team decided to give the man a very expensive potion. Johnny was surprised by this action and didn't know if he should just accept it. Then one of them noticed that for him it was pennies. But a second later, the young man began to openly insult the guy because he assumed that the man was a weakling. The girl began to stand up for him and asked that they never talk like that again. But the hero himself simply stood aside and could do nothing against such strong heroes. Others from the team decided to somehow stop this conflict, but the man simply shut them up. He continued to actively insult Johnny, and he didn't care about any of it. He never accepted people who wanted to offend him in any way, but this did not stop the offender. Meanwhile, the team simply watched this conflict and obeyed the warrior. Unable to bear the bad words directed at him, he decided to show what skill he had in his arsenal. Noticing the secret skill, Liz couldn't believe that her student had it. And then the entire team standing behind him now could not understand how an ordinary newcomer possessed such strength. But as it turned out, he actually didn't want to keep this skill for himself. Johnny wanted to make a wonderful gift for Liz, so he gave her this ability. Then the team was waiting to see what the result would be. The girl reported that her skills really increased 10 times, as it was written in the instructions. The surprised heroes from the team did not know how to now relate to the man who had such power, and his offender, in turn, decided to somehow apologize to Johnny for his behavior. They wanted to be alone, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. So they said goodbye to everyone. Discussing her life, the girl believed that the man treated himself very badly, but he, in turn, did not think so and constantly denied it. In return, she also wanted to give him a gift. Liz then pulled out a specially enchanted book from her pocket that could help Johnny. Sometime later, he wanted to test his new abilities in the land of the dead. There were a lot of strange monsters to practice on. They took turns actively killing all the monsters, but unfortunately they gave few points for them. When the system showed that the boss was about to appear, Liz decided to ask the team for reinforcements. And they, in turn, did not know how to react to such an event because it was very rare. Talking to her friend, the heroine wanted to know for sure whether they would be helped. But when the team didn't hear a clear answer, Les realized they would have to fight alone. Johnny was not at all frightened by this news. He even liked that now he could show what he was capable of. At first he wanted to use his power, which he planned to activate against his opponent. Meanwhile, the cemetery began to gradually come to life and competitors began to appear from the ground. But as it turned out, Johnny and his friend were not alone here. The other team was also surprised to see any competitors on their way. The players finally decided to help their old friend with whom they were constantly competing. Seeing such a strong team, some of the opponents could not believe that they existed. Meanwhile, Johnny was actively making his way through the monsters and it was quite easy for him to do so. And then a rival appeared that the hero was not ready to see. But the demon had no intention of taking pity on any stranger on his land. He wanted to teach a lesson to the guy who started mercilessly killing all his people who worked for him. But Johnny didn't care at all about his opponent's magical skills because he was ready for it. With each passing second, the battle became more intense, but the young man continued to feel well. When his strength began to run out, the hero finally activated a special ability. Then there was a huge explosion, and the system started rewarding him with awards. In this way, the man was able to reach level 30, which was not so easy to reach. But it was not so easy for his team to hold back such a brutal attack of monsters. Liz made the decision to retreat quickly because she saw that the team had already received nothing, although some allies still tried to fight the monsters together. At that moment, in another area, Johnny came to improve his skills. Then a woman met him and asked him again whether he really wanted this sincerely. He was not going to give up his desires and wanted to protest what level of stars he now had. Her partner, who was nearby, noticed that the aura in the demon graveyard began to deteriorate. Johnny managed to overhear these conversations, but he could not influence them in any way. The woman wanted the man to sort it out himself and asked him to take some action. As soon as Johnny found himself in the building where he could choose a profession, he was immediately at a loss. But he only had 3 days to make up his mind. Once in the dungeon, many new but at the same time dangerous things awaited him. There were many other participants around, but everyone was surprised when they saw a newcomer alone. Johnny understood that the entire organization he had gotten into was a complete secret. The woman who met the hero was in charge of those who hunted monsters. Her entire team was truly frightened by the outburst of the monster's enormous power. So they all had to call for reinforcements, as the situation could lead to a huge disaster. Meanwhile, Johnny knew that there were many more skills that could be unlocked for him. And when he noticed that the system had sent a new spell for him, he was completely surprised. Now he was sure that no losses were at all scary for him. Having planned everything well, he went to the stock exchange. There he was met by a charming woman who could have been his assistant. Johnny was very strange and wanted a completely different manager, so he went looking for her. Johnny was very keen to sell his winning books and get good money for them, but he couldn't even imagine that the head of the exchange would become very interested in him after this. After all, the young man brought rather precious things every time. As soon as he resolved all his issues, he immediately invited his assistant to celebrate the event. Everything was great and they both had a good time. But the girl had to go to the hospital to see her father. She was incredibly happy that it was thanks to Johnny that she was able to pay for the precious treatment. Everything was going too well, but at some point her car began to flip over. Everything around was flying apart as if an earthquake had started, but these were real monsters. She couldn't believe that such terrible events could happen in the city's safe zone, and where those monsters came from. These were indeed healthy mutants that ordinary people could not cope with. The man who came to the girl's aid ordered her to quickly leave the place. Under her feet, instead of earth, there was only rot, so much so that it was impossible to stand normally. Everyone realized that there was a majestic monster in their city that was about to cause a real catastrophe. But some upstart appeared who thought he could definitely handle everything. Another one even found it funny. But at that moment, a monster appeared who wanted all the inhabitants of that city to be sacrificed to him. Meanwhile, while Johnny was doing his business in the toilet, the building was in complete chaos. People were lying around everywhere, simply torn to pieces. There were pools full of blood, and monsters were jumping around like frogs. Johnny couldn't believe what he saw with his own eyes. So he quickly decided to use his purple skill, which could enhance all of his earth spells. Now the hero understood that he would have to meet in battle with his husband, who considered himself very strong. But as soon as they both met in battle, the monster covering his fighter felt the breath of death from Johnny. At that moment, the man could not believe that all his attacks were blocked, and the hand he directed forward immediately broke. As soon as the opponent turned to his boss for help, he noticed that this was no longer the case. All his demon assistants also quickly began to retreat, and he was left alone. His strength gradually began to leave his body. As soon as the hero finished his fight, he knew very well that he had to quickly leave that place. He also decided that he had to take everything he could get. Meanwhile, the squad leader tried to get information regarding those demons. It was very interesting for them that the demons suddenly attacked, and then suddenly retreated. So there must have been some strange warrior who managed to stop all this. The girls decided to go to the other side of the city and scout out the situation there. What they saw surprised them greatly. First, we met another warrior who was quite handsome, and also noticed the trumpets of another warrior. But none of them understood who managed to kill him. The stranger admitted that it was because of that deceased that the monsters were able to get into the city, and that is why he betrayed his organization. The woman understood that the captain, who was dead, was considered the strongest of the third transformation. Meanwhile, Johnny was quietly at home, trying to sort through all his new gifts. Some of them he believed did not respond at all to the warrior he killed. Among the various objects he noticed a pendant and hoped that there was no god hidden in it. At that moment, the hero decided that he had closed the kingdom in time and hoped that no one could surround him. Johnny began to remember that there was one moment during the fight when he could have screwed up. But fortunately, everything turned out well. Now everyone surrounded the soldier who managed to survive in the hospital and tried to find out something from him. They couldn't believe that there was such a strong one among them, but they didn't know him. And the young man whom everyone considered the strongest in that world was mysteriously killed. The woman understood that everything could only have happened thanks to ordinary magic, traces of which were at the crime scene. A wounded man would be very happy if such a warrior were nearby. Then he could feel safe. But then they came to the conclusion that the unknown killer could even be a mutant. But these were just thoughts. It was then that Johnny tried again to go to the professions building and choose the next one. What opened up before him were not just any landscapes. Some events took place on the stock exchange a little earlier. They had a new customer who needed new kits. Mr. Willie's assistant immediately noticed a very handsome blonde man. But it was very important for the client to find exactly the person who wanted to sell this set. Willie immediately remembered that Johnny was its owner, but decided that he had obtained it illegally. It was just before this situation that the boss tried to get some information about the hero, and was, to be honest, a little shocked. He turned out to be from an ordinary family, but his parents disappeared in an accident, and only later, when he turned 18, was he able to awaken and become a one-star. The assistant didn't like all this, and she began to consider Johnny to be just trash. While they were figuring all this out, their client disappeared somewhere. Now the woman was absolutely sure that Johnny had stolen all the things he was going to sell. Johnny didn't even expect that he was now being watched. He moved calmly through the cave and looked at the statues that were in front of him. But in the meantime, the blonde was watching him, who couldn't believe that he was really stronger than him. Sam noticed that Johnny was trying to equip himself and that his full strength could therefore be determined. Now it was clear to Sam that the baby was deliberately hiding his location. But the blonde was shocked a little later that Johnny could also have absolute protection. This completely nailed him. While Sam was watching all this, Johnny felt quite confident and did not even suspect any danger. All the monsters were afraid of Johnny and just fought him. The hero found a suitable place to use his skills. But before that, he looked back and made sure that no one was following him. The demon that Johnny wanted to deal with was scared and even looked for a place to hide. This one had never seen such destructive magic before. It was truly frightening. It was now clear that Johnny's power was far greater than that of their master. Sam decided that it was enough to sit in ambush and it was time to act. He tried his best to catch up with Johnny. The hero was now absolutely sure that the young man who was following him had seen everything, but Johnny needed to finish the job. It was decided to discuss everything as soon as they got to the top. Sam still couldn't calm down and told about the master with whom he compared Johnny. But the hero was very bored listening to him. He almost fell asleep, but at some point, Johnny decided that it was possible to improve relations with Sam, which could be useful. But everything that happened that day had to be kept secret. Sam realized that Johnny's magic was indeed strong, but it could not harm the innocent. Meanwhile, their conversation was interrupted by Mary's call. While Mary was in her organization, they tried to find out if everything was okay with Johnny. At the organization's meeting, everyone was discussing the mutants that had taken over the city. They were the ones who could use dark magic, and that is why they suffered great losses. The commander immediately turned his attention to the woman and reminded her that she was also a mutant. Everything pointed to the fact that none of the men liked what she was proposing. So their conversation was interrupted by an assistant who brought the latest news. Finding himself in a different place, the guy carefully examined the area in which there was a large barrier. The workers assured everyone that this barrier could withstand a very large amount of pressure from the monsters. But Johnny wasn't going to believe these stories. Meanwhile, people wanted to hear more stories about this city so that they would know what the rules were here. The monsters weren't going to stand still either, so they were actively thinking through their plan of action. Seeing a giant barrier in front of them, they did not understand why people made it. The rivals were confident that their army was unstoppable, and a second later they began their invasion of the city they wanted to capture. When the mighty layer that held the protection began to crack, people began to get scared. They were overcome with real panic from not understanding what would happen to them next. The hero standing next to Johnny wasn't going to just show himself to the monsters. At that moment, he began to activate his magic, which could protect him during attacks from his opponents. But he also wanted to talk to the guy to know what they should do next. Unfortunately, the young man could not give a clear answer to this question, so he became very confused. But the man had already had a ready plan a long time ago. The heroes who had at least some abilities immediately began to fight against the giants. But people were still in a panic, so they started doing unreasonable things. The monsters didn't expect that some heroes could actually give them a worthy answer. And even such abilities of the heroes did not stop them in this battle. But the heroes' resistance only further angered their rivals. After some time, the hero began to notice that his attacks had no effect on the monster at all. In response, the ugly woman decided to deliver a decisive blow with her sword. And then something happened that no one expected, namely the new guy blocked this blow. At first the freaks couldn't believe their eyes because they thought it was impossible. Enraged, he began to use all the magic he had against the invaders. The monsters, in turn, did not expect such an answer from the stranger. And Johnny continued to stand aside and calmly watch as his student tore everyone apart. People were also shocked by the hero's abilities, because he alone dealt with the army. Fortunately, there weren't many monsters left, because their leader had already been killed. When it was all over, Johnny was incredibly happy with his student's results. The young man politely wanted to know if he still had something to do. The hero immediately began to deny it, when suddenly people began to approach them. They all wanted to talk to the city's new protector and see what skills he had. But before they had time to discuss everything, the mayor of the city came to him personally. The first thing the man did was to express his gratitude for such help. And later he offered his services to somehow thank the heroes. But as it turned out, they weren't the only ones who wanted to thank the young men who saved this city. At first, the mayor wanted to give them a flight crystal, which was considered a very expensive thing. Hearing such good news, Johnny was shocked by such a gift. The husband still wanted them to stay for a few days. Then Johnny said that he had a very busy schedule and couldn't do it. And a few minutes later, their award was finally brought to them, presented to them by the city mayor. Before they wanted to show this area, he wanted to know or could count on their help. In response, the young man smiled politely and confirmed his assumption. Therefore, all the city residents were incredibly happy to hear this. Unfortunately, the heroes must already set off on their new mission in another world. Meanwhile, in another city, the team was waiting for their friends. When they met, they began to discuss their teammates, and Liz thought that she had seen them with the flight crystal. But the hero had a different opinion because he thought that they didn't have the money for such a quick skill. When she heard negative words directed at Johnny again, she immediately began to defend him. A small conflict arose between them, in which the young man did not understand what he had said. Luckily, the girl stopped everything immediately and didn't want them to quarrel. But Liz was determined to prove her true opinion. But at times she couldn't do this, because she hadn't yet reached the required level. The hero assumed that she simply needed to train more. But a moment later, she reported news that surprised everyone very much. As it turned out, the girl was actually able to open a special task, which was a great rarity. Johnny continued to rejoice at his new achievements. But meanwhile, his friend Sam constantly tried to be near him. Liz kept trying to change her profession, but nothing worked, and she immediately noticed Johnny's gift. But the players on her team were surprised that suddenly the profession was determined exactly when the awakening took place. Many were sure that Liz had made the wrong choice and that her life could have fallen apart, but she was confident in what she was doing. Her friend even wanted to have a friend like Johnny to receive such gifts. Meanwhile, while the woman was watching the players, she noticed a blonde man who was with Johnny the whole time. According to intelligence and despite his age, he already possessed the power of the fourth transformation. So as soon as teacher Mary noticed her best student, she decided that a lot depended on her. Johnny knew immediately that something was definitely wrong. Mary immediately wanted to discuss the current situation with him. She had to know if Johnny really hadn't fallen into the dark force. It was at that moment that he realized that many people had probably already found out what he was trying to hide. So Sam immediately announced that he would leave them alone. Liz tried to convey that there were some anomalies, and the realm's intrusion into reality was constantly increasing. The hero immediately understood what was being discussed and assured that he was definitely not a mutant. But this had to be proven by putting all his power into the black crystal. But as soon as he touched it, everything shattered into small pieces. The situation began to get out of control because the crystal should have just shaken. While everyone was discussing their affairs, Johnny decided to meet his teacher Mary. She felt very sorry for him because the young man was able to awaken his potential very late. But he never in his life blamed Mary for this. And she, in turn, continued to apologize to him because she had the idea that as a teacher she should do this. At the end of their collaboration, she decided to give him a nice gift. In response, he also did not intend to come here empty-handed and brought a thing of orange quality. Seeing such a strong ability, she couldn't accept it. The young man began to insist that she should not refuse his gift. On such a wonderful note, they ended their conversation because Johnny had to leave with his partner. Meanwhile, in another office, Mary was already talking with her colleague. They were eager to understand as quickly as possible how Johnny was able to possess such skills. But they could not find an answer to this question. That day the girl agreed to everything because she was dependent on them and did not have her own opinion. They also wanted to focus their attention on another warrior gaining momentum. The guy noticed that his boss was feeling unwell and wanted to know what was wrong. Johnny stressed that the investigation into him was finally over that day. His student was very happy and thought that this was great news. But the young man was experiencing something completely different and did not know how to further improve his level. His opponent wanted to go to a place that was not on official maps because they could improve their skills well. Returning to the hotel, he noticed a stranger who greeted him. They decided to discuss all their affairs at the table, and then the worker offered his candidacy to work for the man. As a sign of the seriousness of this matter, he gave him a rather valuable card. The man thought for a long time about accepting such a gift. Later, he nevertheless accepted this gift because he could help with serious tests. After shaking hands, they agreed to discuss everything another time. The man, as always, was playing his games on his phone and noticed that it was time to go to bed. But before turning off his phone, he wanted to see what his peers in the group were writing. What he saw made him a little angry because they were discussing someone, although now he was much more confident in his abilities and surpassed all his peers. At that moment, his teacher wrote to him and asked him not to pay attention to it. But this only made the young man laugh. From the next day onwards, the woman was at her job as usual. Her colleagues were surprised and thought that they would not see her again today. But she never thought of letting herself be insulted because she knew what cunning people surrounded her. When the conversation turned to Johnny, the woman began to actively defend him. Hearing all this talk, the young man quickly found himself in this place and decided to launch an attack. The worker was incredibly surprised to see this. At the first opportunity, she called security so that the guys could deal with the young man. But Johnny had no intention of being afraid of anyone at all, because he knew that the truth was on his side. When security arrived, she immediately approached the consultant. The bad guys weren't going to talk to the guy, so they decided to attack him. A second later, he received his card from the mayor of the city. And then this changed the situation a lot, and the guys wanted to know where Johnny got it from. He said that he was a good friend of the city's mayor. After hearing these stories, the man and the guards realized that they had made a big mistake. It didn't take long before the mayor started calling them personally and wanted to find out what the matter was. At that moment, workers blocked all entrances for people while important matters were being carried out. The city leader immediately started shouting loudly at him. As soon as he finished saying "scoundrel," I immediately began to apologize to him for such an act. He also stressed several times that this would never happen again. They decided to calmly go into the room and rest after such difficult events. But not much time had passed before they noticed that the mayor of the city was running quickly towards them with his partner. They were very shocked by this news. At first, the woman who called security was very scared, and all the workers could no longer resist the city mayor. In the end, the man wanted to know if the young man really didn't want them to apologize to him. Meanwhile, taking advantage of the moment, the guard hit the woman with all his might. Having made themselves some delicious tea, they began to discuss their lives. But the director still wanted to somehow thank the young man, but he refused. Recalling the events, the mayor of the city noticed how Johnny was choosing something for himself. The hero decided to tell that it was the final relic that was important to him. But of all those present in this room, no one understood what was being discussed. Even a fighter who was quite knowledgeable about different arsenals. He reported that he found his magic book yesterday evening. And a second later I decided to analyze what skills and capabilities were there. After that day, his thoughts were filled with only one thing: how could he find the final relic? Returning to the present day, the man had to leave the young men, and they in turn decided to have something to eat in the near future. Arriving at the student's home, he was very surprised that the city had given him such a house. The guy noticed that if the boss needed money, he could easily give it to him. But then he had a completely different plan that he wanted to implement. While the young man continued to rest peacefully, the phone suddenly rang. It turned out to be an employee who had recently started working for him and was leading a group that was conducting an investigation. After asking a few more questions, the young man could not answer them, which made the matter more difficult. Johnny considered people who were looking for something on him to be bad, because they always got in his way and prevented him from living a normal life. At the meeting, everyone, of course, began to discuss precisely that secret hero whom no one had seen. Some even believed that these were just fabrications. That's why the leaders even decided that an investigation needed to be conducted. This is why all the information about Johnny was changed, but only his teacher knew about it. She couldn't let the warriors expose him. But one brave fighter nevertheless said that he would take on the entire investigation, and the others could go about their business. Very soon he found himself in a secret kingdom where he was met by guards. The man couldn't believe that the power that remained there was still so powerful. Although it was not his first time there, the scale of the destruction simply fascinated him. At some point it seemed that the man had turned into a monster. He just screamed relentlessly and thought that it was all just his. At that moment, Johnny felt that something was trying to contact him precisely because of the aura. Therefore, I tried to determine the location of that amazing object or creature. He quickly got ready and left, but his assistant still could not understand what had happened. Johnny continued to watch the navigator and realized that it was approaching the cemetery. It was at that very moment that something simply terrible was happening there. The warrior was truly turned into a monster from which he could now in no way escape. As soon as all the women from the organization got to that place, they could not believe what they saw with their own eyes. When the hero saw this creature, he immediately decided that he could immediately use a spell to knock it out. Meanwhile, the teacher was trying to save her colleague with the help of Johnny's gift. They understood that it would be very difficult to deal with that monster. When the demon saw the young man, he did not believe that he could possess such power. But everything was still ahead. Johnny immediately began to show what he was capable of, and did not even expect that all his skills would increase 100-fold. But immediately after that, some pretty strange things started happening in his head. Sam couldn't sit still and followed, of course, his boss. As soon as I saw everything that happened there, I knew for sure that Johnny had dealt with the monster. In fact, Johnny really enjoyed fighting the monster, especially when he felt he had an advantage over it. Now you could leave all the cleaning to your assistant. Sam knew for a fact that his boss lived up to his reputation, and so he decided that he had underestimated him a little. Everything became clear. The warrior used the investigation as an opportunity to enter the secret realm and absorb the dark forces. But everything ended not in his favor because he did not calculate that the monster would lose control. The entire organization was 100% sure that the city had its own secret hero who was protecting them. The city's leadership decided that it could do everything to meet all his needs. Meanwhile, Johnny was calmly at home and trying to get himself in order. Sam kept trying to cover for his boss and throw everyone off guard. After all, he and Johnny had figured out what needed to be said long before this situation. The assistant also admitted that he was familiar with the hero, but knew well that he did not want to be disturbed. Liz simply couldn't believe that she had heard all this because she was sure that it was Johnny. Johnny immediately remembered that the end of the world was about to come, and space would not be able to hold these demons. Before, he understood that all the awakened professions still could not reach their optimal form. But fortunately, it was not only their time and space that suffered from the secret kingdom. All his thoughts at that time were interrupted by an important call. It was Liz who invited him to dinner, which made Johnny incredibly happy. Meanwhile, the whole team greeted their comrade who managed to reach the second transformation. In fact, he was very angry, although he didn't show it. After all, when he invited Liz to dinner, she immediately refused him and left. That's why the man was sure that the gap between her and the team would definitely grow. The friend, of course, was convinced that Liz had important reasons for doing so. But the warrior knew that the time would come, and she would definitely leave their team and not even look back in the end. While the team was wondering why Liz did this, she was enjoying her dinner. Liz was constantly thinking about finding a suitable emblem for Johnny, but apparently he wasn't very interested in it. He simply couldn't take his eyes off his food for even a minute. Now he knew that in order to taste such delicious dishes, he had to follow the teacher. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a phone call. But Johnny didn't know who was on the other end of the line, and the stranger didn't really want to admit it. After the conversation, the young man noticed that the teacher was holding his shoulder. It turned out that she had been injured during the mission, and now it took time to recover. Liz began to worry a little about that call, since she hadn't divulged any information. The unknown person started calling and threatening again, so they decided to leave the establishment. As soon as Johnny came home, he immediately saw the one who called him. But the young man was not at all in the mood to sort things out and wanted to sleep. The guest was very unhappy with the way Johnny answered and immediately started yelling at him. Everything started to happen completely differently than the invaders wanted. But before attacking the hero, they were able to simply destroy his apartment. Johnny immediately gathered his strength and began to use his skills. As he expected from the improvement of all his properties, the reactions improved significantly. All his enemies began to fly away in all directions. They didn't expect the hero to have such power, because they knew that he only had a one-star profession. Now Johnny had the upper hand over them and wanted to be treated properly. The young man realized that the situation looked very bad and decided to hide. But of course he failed to do this. With many bruises from Johnny, they began to tell who sent them to him. No one expected that the hero could handle many situations without a spell, just with his bare hands. Meanwhile, Liz's colleague was thinking of a plan to intimidate her a little and then offer a helping hand. But no one expected that the girl would be so strong and defeat her boss. So the man admitted that he had already sent several guys to deal with her friend Johnny, but they had no idea who they had to face. There was not a single living place left on their bodies. Not realizing the scale of the problem, they decided to take a little rest in some quiet place. The hero understood that it was very dangerous to leave him in his apartment. Since his house was in a normal area, high-level awakened ones could enter without hindrance. While the hero was lost in his thoughts, a fight broke out between the men, but no one even guessed who their opponent was. Once their bodies were reduced to ashes, there was no evidence left of them. Having dealt with his enemies, Johnny tried to get some rest, and Sam was ready to find out who their boss was. Now Johnny was ready to find an alchemist, but one who would not lose control over his actions. But Sam didn't really know how he could help his boss, but he thought about what could be done. All the alchemists he knew had already become very experienced and were members of a large guild. But one day Johnny remembered who else he could turn to and immediately started calling. Liz immediately agreed to help because she definitely had one suitable man in mind. The hero, without wasting any time, began to recall all his recipes and prepared for the meeting. He was met by a rather interesting alchemist, with whom they immediately got along. The doctor thought that all the ingredients in the recipes were ordinary, but the method was quite complicated. Johnny immediately explained that he was interested in the potion that could increase experience by 100%. So the man asked the young man to wait for him a little while he did some experiments. Time passed and Johnny continued to wait, but very soon strange sounds began to come from the upper floor. Johnny's team immediately decided to go up and see everything with their own eyes. On the way, they were met by a slime flying right down the corridor, which was very strange. The girls realized that everything worked, and were therefore confident that the other recipes were also correct. After the alchemist drank some of the prepared potion and tested it on the slime, the experience really increased several times. Now they had to decide where they could sell such recipes, but the man immediately suggested keeping it a secret. Very soon everyone decided that it was necessary to give this potion only to close people and then think about selling it. Johnny knew he had to take care of his own power first, and then put such precious items on the market. It was at that moment that he received a bunch of important messages from the teacher, and now knew that training was planned. The hero remembered one member of the team to whom he decided to offer some potion. The girls also didn't waste time and came up with ideas for who could raise their level a little more. But the alchemist still could not rejoice in these recipes and constantly studied them. Although he was very talented, he certainly couldn't have thought of something like this, so he was very grateful. The guy couldn't believe that now everyone was so immersed in those recipes that they weren't paying attention to him. And the alchemist dreamed of having a little time to prepare a potion just for them all. Next, all school children who decided to participate in the training were directed to the designated place. Johnny was also ready, but decided to wait for his girlfriend. Once they got where they needed to go, they were very surprised that there were so many people around. Johnny's team was also already prepared, but they did not understand why they were being watched. The other participants wasted no time and moved a little closer to the entrance of the secret kingdom. Some of the school members were angry that Johnny was the one who could enter the kingdom with their teacher. But it was a big surprise to Mary that it was Johnny who was with the Sacred Lion Guild team. And these three were actually newcomers to the state list of newcomers, so they immediately headed forward. It didn't take more than a couple of minutes before one of the participants decided to try the potion and was very stunned by the result. They tried to thank their boss and also offer their help if needed. The girl was pleased that Johnny felt happy and confident, because it was not always like that. When he turned 16, many laughed at him, saying that his awakening was a complete failure. Meanwhile, the alchemist wanted to explain to all the participants that the potion was very valuable, but not so expensive. Before starting the training, all important issues needed to be discussed. Since Liz was the one responsible for most of the operation, she tried to give everyone specific instructions. Johnny understood that he didn't need to interfere yet, but rather calmly observe the team's abilities. But it didn't take long. The demons were already nearby. The battle began, and everything happened quite quickly, so there was a large number of enemies. It wasn't long before Liz stopped training and noticed another team approaching them. Their leader couldn't help but laugh because he thought that there definitely couldn't be anyone better there. But he didn't understand that the alchemist was doing everything to ensure that his team's experience would gain colossal momentum with the help of the potion. Noticing their competitors in front of them, they were very surprised. But the man didn't want to fight them then. He subsequently decided to offer Lisa a great opportunity to join his team. The girls I knew standing nearby were simply amazed after hearing this. She didn't plan to think about it for long because she didn't want to move to another team. The group leader also emphasized that she could have taken her best student, who was ranked 14th, with her. And even after such a proposal, she again rejected the idea. He continued to emphasize that the girl should take her time and make a wise decision. The opponent was sure that the acquaintances standing next to her were complete weaklings. She was not going to listen to such criticism of her team and decided to stand up for them. When he noticed that the girl began to take out her rival's sword, he simply began to mock her. After analyzing all these events, Johnny understood that Liz was now in a weak position. While the team leaders were busy with their business, one of the opposing team members began to criticize the fighter. Nobody wanted it to come to blows, so the participant asked everyone to calm down. The big boss wasn't going to listen to this. He was confident that he would easily defeat the team because they were weak to him. When the young man realized that there was no other way out but to hit his competitor, that is exactly what he decided to do. After this, the giant responded with his powerful blow. The man felt that he had many broken ribs and was no longer able to compete. Then Liz began to protect her students, but the leader of the thieves stood in their way. With the last of his strength, he began to fight his powerful opponent. But a second later, he noticed that he was too weak, and then the team decided to support him. When the giant wanted to strike a powerful blow, Johnny easily stopped him in the moment. In response, the young man used wonderful magic, which simply stopped the enemy. The giant didn't quite know what to do in this situation because his body simply froze. Taking advantage of the moment, the young man activated magic. And a second later, he threw the thief several meters away from the team. The leader was afraid for his warrior and decided to help him. Taking advantage of the moment, Liz immediately loaded her arsenal and carefully studied the enemy. Her team realized that they had seized the initiative and were now ahead of their opponents. Johnny was pleased with his result because now he had improved his reputation. In order not to stand idle, the girl decided to help her ally. Now the guy was sure that they could take the equipment of the young men who attacked them, but their main rival immediately began to deny this. When Johnny heard any objections, his face immediately changed. And then the thief realized that they simply had no other choice. Another member of their team said that she gave everything she had in her arsenal. Having completely robbed the bad team, they decided to return to another area. There, the teacher began to praise the boy for his excellent work, but he thought it was too much because he just did his job. She continued to assure him that he had indeed done a very good job. At that moment, the young man felt incredibly pleased that his efforts were appreciated. The first thing the team wanted to know was where Johnny wanted to go after this. This was a very difficult decision for him because he had no opinion. After analyzing his skills later, he realized that he didn't need to go anywhere. Having met their old friend Sam, they wanted to spend time together. The team thoroughly enjoyed the delicious food, and also played a lot of video games and just wasted our time. Having rested after such a difficult test, they began to get down to business. At the beginning, the hero wanted to call one man and discuss the details of the auction with them. As it turned out, the gentleman didn't really like discussing such matters over the phone, so he suggested meeting. Their first meeting took place in a beautiful place, where the young men were already waiting for their partner. The worker, who was always next to him, began to tell him all the information. The man himself had only recently started working at this job, so he didn't really understand it. Taking the gadget in his hands, he began to analyze the information, and I saw a rather rare thing there and wanted to know where they got it from. The worker began to talk about some team that gave them the opportunity to get this arsenal. Now the guy's assumptions began to disagree. The man, who had become a little better acquainted, began to talk about a new task for the young men. This news interested them very much, but they decided to find out more information. The employee also took an active part in this, because she wanted to tell everything in more detail. But she herself did not intend to attend the new auction. When finally the system showed him that he had a new task, then Johnny was incredibly happy about such wonderful news. When they got home, the boys decided to get to know the new tests better. Later, the boys realized that the kingdom was not so far from them. Hiding under a green blouse, Johnny wanted to get inside this building. It turned out to be not so easy to get through everywhere because there were guards there. He thought he could easily deceive them. But in reality, everything turned out to be not so simple, and as soon as he wanted to go inside, a big explosion occurred. After some time, he returned to his bed in his room. Johnny wanted to know why he couldn't complete a task that was usually easy for him. This made him very angry, and he could no longer control his emotions. After some time, a man who could restore their bodies decided to join them. After analyzing the health condition, he saw that the guards were in perfect order. Workers later reported that they did not notice the explosion. The group leader wanted to talk about this in more detail, but it turned out to be quite difficult for the men to remember all the events. A member of the team decided to use magic through which they could see a little. A strange silhouette of a black man began to appear in the distance from them. Everyone on the team was scared because they knew that it was a demon who wanted to take over their world. At that moment, another participant with powerful strength took her side. After all these events, they decided to all get together to discuss it. But before that, they remembered the words of their husband, who really wanted to help them destroy the demon. Subsequently, a group of people began to express their position. But unfortunately, all their opinions did not converge and were completely different. The man who played a more important role than the others began to impose his opinion on them. He was sure that if the door to the kingdom opened, many demons would crawl out from there. After a long period of discussion, they did not come to a common opinion. Finally, the man decided to find out the opinion of one more warrior, but he did not hear an answer. While the men were solving their problems, Johnny was enjoying the peace and quiet and the new task. Johnny also mentioned how he met the director of the adventurer's office. It was this meeting that his assistant Sam arranged for him. This man had indeed many achievements and participated in the development of many large kingdoms. The man also decided to introduce his best student, who was the head of the Lonely Shadows. Meanwhile, the powerful mutant was very angry, as his investigation did not yield any results at all. That's why one of the team asked for the mutant student to help with this. These were the very individuals who were kept a big secret. But the director was an exception, because he could frighten with his appearance. The man was really pleased to meet Johnny and also prepared a gift. He calmly pointed to the box that contained 5 million crystals and 200 bottles of expert-grade potion. Johnny's surprise simply knew no bounds, so he began to rejoice like a child. But that wasn't all. They really wanted the secret hero to watch the video they had. As soon as the hero saw this, he definitely couldn't imagine himself like that. He thought that for everyone he was an ordinary high school student. But Johnny promised that he would give the video to the secret hero and would report the result later. After meeting them, the man was now absolutely sure that they were going to win him over to their side. Meanwhile, the guy still tried to calm himself down, since no one knew yet that he was the god of evil. The girl was very interested in whether the mentor thought that Johnny and the secret hero were one and the same person. But he just wanted to hope that it was the secret hero who could become their strongest support. As soon as he returned, he noticed that it was the research that had damaged his system that was following him. That's why Johnny turned to Sam for help. Since Johnny's defense was destroyed, he knew that his enemy had reached the forbidden level of the spell. Sam tried to explain that the structure of the testing realm resembled a tower that had many floors. And Johnny immediately came up with the idea of involving another person in his task. So they headed to the training room and met with the director and his assistant. Many of those present did not understand what such a young participant was doing there while everyone else was killing monsters. But the director knew that it was Johnny who wanted to send someone to the guild to take part in the test. But everything was very difficult, because all the heads of the 7 guilds decided to challenge the kingdom of testing. At such moments, the man's head turned into a large flame. This was the price he paid in life. But Johnny knew nothing about this, and was therefore ready to continue his task. The assistant immediately drew attention to the system, which showed even all the monsters' weaknesses. Sam was also ready because with his permission, the man wanted to watch how everything would go. They exchanged all the information and were ready to start everything. But the old man still wanted to know that the secret hero had once recalled that the god of evil could destroy the world. But as long as those two were there, that certainly couldn't happen. When the boys discussed all their actions earlier, they came to the conclusion that the director should not have been told the truth. That is why the man chose Sam for the subsequent test. As soon as Sam found himself on a mission, he didn't even have time to blink, and the demons were already attacking him. All the other members of his team had the opportunity to observe what was happening. The assistant noticed that the monsters had crossed the limit of the 4th transformation, and the test became even more difficult. It was really hard for this one to deal with the demons. Meanwhile, Johnny was trying to contact his friend on the microphone. Sam decided to take a little rest and continue. He really didn't want to let down the boss who was relying on him. Johnny was very worried and knew that if his friend couldn't handle it, he would have to finish it. So he decided to part with everyone and prepare just in case. In order to remain undetected, he used a flight scroll which should last for a while. But he knew very well that all this had to be done before school started. The hero immediately found himself in one of the secret kingdoms and decided to study everything there thoroughly. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, a group of demons noticed the flight scroll and were sure that they were people. Indeed, the captain of the group of people understood that the mutants were supposed to attack in the secret kingdom. The husband was upset that everything had to happen on his birthday. He decided to call his son and warn him about the alarm, and also to tell him to listen to his mother's instructions. The captain made the decision to immediately notify the authorities and quickly evacuate as many people as possible. The mutants also did not waste time and began to prepare for the meeting in order to bring more sacrifices for their master. It was thanks to the corpses of people that the great ruler could accumulate enough strength and energy. The defenders understood that the mutants could attack the nearest city first, so they had to act. All the monsters of the secret kingdom were terrible and spared no one. The captain understood that they had no strength or support, so they would definitely not be able to resist. That's why he decided to stay there and send his other comrades home. But no one wanted to leave him. As soon as they started running away, they immediately noticed that an intense flash of dark forces was already in the air. The Lord was already prepared for the invasion and wanted to demonstrate his incredible power. But he did not understand that he would have to meet another secret hero who was also in the kingdom. Meanwhile, the captain saw that enough time had passed, but no invasion had taken place. Without wasting any time, he decided to get up and check everything with his own eyes. That's where this terrible surprise awaited him. The mutants were shocked to see only one young man in the dungeon. The chief even decided that he was just a newbie and could not harm them at all. But when it became dark around them, they realized that it was all very strange. Then the bravest one threatened that he was a criminal who had destroyed more than 200 lives. But this did not frighten Johnny at all. He was ready to fight. The entire team of mutants didn't know what to do now as they raised their heads to the mountain and opened their mouths. Johnny was ready to demonstrate to them his forbidden spell that he had just discovered. It was on this monster that the decision was made to use it. When the captain arrived at the scene, he certainly didn't expect this. The Overlord was completely frozen, and the criminal and his group were completely defeated. When he became convinced of the bishop's death, he decided that it was necessary to inform everyone. The team members were terrified by what they heard and also did not believe that there was not a single living monster there. Sam continued to train hard, but he still did not see success. Then Johnny emphasized that the guy needed some rest. He saw how his student was trying very hard, so he didn't want to disappoint him. Having heard pleasant words addressed to him, he decided to listen to the opinion of a reasonable person. The man also wanted to thank him somehow because Johnny continued to support him. His boss wanted to recuperate and play his favorite games on his phone. Faced with a rather strong opponent, the young man began to doubt his skills. But as it turned out, it was his old friend who played this game well. After spending some time together, the man offered the young man an interesting proposal. In fact, soon the students had to choose universities, and Johnny had the opportunity to try his hand. He thought carefully about this proposal, but a moment later he immediately agreed, knowing that this was his chance. It wasn't long before all the other members had to go to school, and Johnny was no exception. When the teachers started announcing the tournament, some of the classmates became very angry. After all, they had the same level as Johnny, although their stars were much higher. The woman stopped the conflict in time and said that they had to have a new student. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the new girl except for the guy who didn't care. But as soon as the heroine entered the classroom, he immediately realized that he had seen her somewhere before. The girl was a little shy, but still decided to introduce herself in front of everyone. The first thing she did was choose a place for herself with the guy, and then the man didn't know what that could mean. The girl's classmates didn't really like this choice and decided that Johnny was again to blame for everything. The principal of another school wanted to discuss with her husband why they had poached their girlfriend. The young man didn't like this decision at all, because he knew that their rating could fall very sharply. The competitor began to assure that he had nothing to do with it, since he hadn't decided for the girl. But before they could finish speaking, they heard a knock on the door. It turned out to be a worker who said that someone wanted to see him. The school principal emphasized that he was busy at the moment and could not come. But when they heard who exactly was calling them, they were, to put it mildly, surprised. These were very important people who could only be seen on television. Also standing next to them was Johnny, who turned out to be the grandson of this influential man. At this school, everyone knew that the boy was ranked 12th and had good abilities. Their conversation did not end there because he wanted to help his grandson to the end. The husband said that it was thanks to him that the school allocated 2 excellent places for the strongest warriors. The directors were surprised for a long time and did not know how to properly discuss all this. He had no desire to detain them together with the men. Back in class, everyone was a little upset, but Johnny didn't understand what had happened. The young man wanted to brighten the atmosphere, and then everyone started paying attention to him. The student was really happy that he had many friends, but this didn't suit the girl very well, because she wanted to win his authority among everyone else. And the company, in turn, continued to have a great time. Meanwhile, the man continued to spend his time in his room. But when the worker approached him, he immediately said that he had no news for the man. He suggested that he call the police to find the person he needed so much. He immediately objected to this proposal because he thought that it was unnecessary. Having climbed up to the 2nd floor of his house, he entered the room. And a second later, he opened the secret room located behind the paintings. Meanwhile, at school, the students were showing off their skills, and the guy showed off a gift for Johnny. Discussing their events on this gift for the young man did not end. The girl, who also appeared recently, wanted to give Jonah a good skill. He was pleasantly surprised by this, but at the same time a little upset. The young man realized that at the moment he could not discover these skills for himself. After all, he needed to go to a special area to activate his gifts. In return, he also wanted to do something nice for the young men and gave them an elite potion. The girl did not expect such an act and understood that it was quite expensive. But then Liz, who hadn't seen him for a long time, joined them. A second later, she showed that she had also brought something for the young man, and then he was shocked. Arriving home, he immediately began to tell his old friend how much he had received today. He decided to immediately share something pleasant with his friend. He did not expect such an act and was incredibly happy. But Johnny noticed that his friend had to drink it right away at that moment to start the special training. As soon as he activated the potion, he immediately felt a surge of great energy and strength. Johnny began to mentally prepare him for the fact that now the young man would fight against heavy monsters. This didn't frighten Sam at all because he had been ready for a long time. When it was time for the fight to begin, the young man began to worry a little and doubt his strength. The manager calmed him down a little and also emphasized that he would support him. Having changed into the necessary clothes, he waited for the first strike. As soon as the monster managed to hit the young man well, he immediately curled up in pain. Johnny wanted to know if the student could continue to fight, but the hero did not want to let his master down. Quickly getting back on his feet, he was ready to fight on. Having gathered his strength, the young man immediately began to attack the monster in response. But the monster really turned out to be a strong competitor. After a few minutes, he finally managed to overcome her. But without resting for a minute, Sam was ready to fight on. Subsequently, the test was already over, and the powerless man fell to the ground. Grandpa Johnny, who was watching all this, was simply shocked at how the warrior managed to do this. He began to get very nervous, and his head seemed to be on fire. The girl who always stood nearby also couldn't explain how an ordinary fighter managed to do this. She also began to worry about the health of the man standing next to her. But he constantly noted that everything was fine with him. Arriving in another area, after some time they noticed new people. Then one of the strongest teams was glad to welcome such warriors. Sam tried to be polite, but he knew that these were not the nicest people. He always remembered the words Johnny had told him. Afterwards, they wanted the hero to demonstrate some of his skills to them. At first he didn't want to do it, but after a minute he finally agreed to the proposal. Having launched the live broadcast, the young man calmly prepared for the fight. But the team of heroes wanted to see with their own eyes how it was supposed to happen. Without wasting any time, Johnny also quickly turned on the TV to look at his student. Once the battle began, Sam showed his best side. At times he found it difficult to compete, but that didn't stop him. The team was simply shocked by the young man's abilities. After some time, he came across a really strong opponent. Fortunately, he couldn't stop him. When he passed this exam, he received a rather nice reward. The guys standing nearby and watching everything were furious because they were very jealous. But the young man himself did not expect that he would acquire such a good skill. The 7th reward was replaced by the divine emblem. So now it was necessary to concentrate on the absorption and not be afraid of it. People immediately saw strange phenomena in the sky and began to film everything on their phones. It was at that time that Sam was faced with a choice and chose the path. As soon as it was all over, the guy was able to join his team. Everyone understood perfectly well that the power of his transformation already exceeded the 4th transformation. That's why they immediately offered to join their guild, the Influential House. But since he did not want to consider such proposals, he immediately refused with a smile on his face. As soon as they met Johnny, they immediately began to discuss the divine emblem. The hero was very surprised that his comrade managed to pass the difficult tests, but was glad for him. Now Johnny could not hide the fact that he had once received the same emblem in one dungeon. It even seemed to him that he was very far from all the achievements of his boss. But now together they could create emblems in the secret realms drawn by Johnny. The hero understood that their main problem was not the emblem, but something completely different. Those who passed the tests could receive a forbidden spell, and this could become a threat to Johnny. In addition, Sam reported that the 7 guilds had already begun to search for more secret trial realms. Therefore, it was necessary to ensure that only Johnny's people passed all the tests. But Sam still wanted to tell his comrade something that had happened during his test. When he won, he immediately absorbed the divine emblem, but had to return what was left of it. But the team member already had the recipe for the memory loss potion and had more choice. It seemed to him that it was precisely this that could change the world and attract more powerful individuals. But to do this, it was necessary to silence Sam so that he would not tell about the recipe. The man insisted on maintaining confidentiality under their contract, but was prepared for Sam's answer. The team was simply shocked that the young man had seen such a recipe from his boss. But the commander warned that he was not ready to give up what belonged specifically to him. But the young man did not consider it necessary to continue these meaningless conversations and left this place. He had to meet again with the director, who immediately asked for help. The old man's body was struck by the power of darkness and was being destroyed more and more. That's why he wanted to turn to the secret hero for a potion, so that he could live a couple more years and enjoy his grandson. But Johnny didn't know if this potion would really help, but he set aside a few bottles for the old man. But since the director was holding a very important meeting at the time, the assistant decided to visit his grandson. But no one opened the door, because something terrible was happening there. The young man talked with the demon, but was not ready to accept his conditions, and especially not to betray his loved one. Once things calmed down a bit, the guy met with Johnny and told him a little of his story. When he was little, his parents were killed, and it was a big blow to him. He felt lonely and locked himself in his room all the time. Then the grandfather learned to play the same games that his grandson played, but he did it all in secret. During difficult times for the boy, only his grandfather was there for him and helped him come to his senses. Meanwhile, terrible news was received at work. 2 criminals who brutally murdered 2 adventurers and their families have secretly disappeared from prison. Therefore, everyone had to immediately decide on the issue of searching for them and gather all the necessary forces for this. When they looked at the surveillance cameras, they were shocked by the strength of the villains. The husband understood that if he had to fight them, he would definitely lose. Grandpa Parker remembered that his son and daughter-in-law sacrificed their lives to close the passage to the secret kingdom. Thanks to them, the entire city avoided disaster. And now these scumbags were walking free and heading towards their boss. They tried to attach that the husband's son was nowhere to be found. But while they were searching, they felt an incredibly strong force of darkness. They had to check the dark room that their boss's son used, but the placement was incorrect. The man was shocked that everything pointed to his son having attracted the attention of the demon lord. So just like these scoundrels could end up in the secret kingdom and conduct training there. But the father only knew that his son had to perform a certain ritual. Since the conversation could be ended, the killers said that they still needed to visit one person. Meanwhile, Parker's grandson had no idea that a terrible meeting awaited him. As soon as they appeared on the threshold, an aura of danger emanated from them. The young man was a little stunned and did not understand what they wanted from him. The men said that they were acting under the power of attorney of their master, and that they should be called elder brothers. But since there was no other way out, the young man immediately began to attack in order to protect himself. While one was busy with the boy, the other reported that Mr. Parker was not there. The villain tried to assure Parker's grandson that his boss had big plans for him. Therefore, in order to save his grandfather, the baby had to agree to all their conditions. But the grandfather also could not sit idly by, and with Sam he looked for a way to become stronger. Meanwhile, Johnny still couldn't find a better place to level up, so he gained experience in the secret kingdom. Suddenly, his training was interrupted by an important call. Parker's grandson was hospitalized after meeting with guests. His body was in perfect order, but the power of darkness still needed to be tested. The kid also told Johnny about the giant who gave him only 3 days, and after that his grandfather had to die. But we didn't have to wait long, and the enemy had already decided to visit the hospital. It was these 2 that Grandpa and Sam were talking about, but they had no idea that they were already nearby. They instantly stopped everything and rushed into Parker's grandson's room. At that moment, the scoundrel offered some fruit to the baby, because they treated him so rudely in the apartment. When Mr. Parker saw the enemies, he could no longer control himself and turned into a fire demon. The man with a sly smile suggested competing with the leader, but he understood that he would not be able to fight such a strong warrior. The man tried not to react to it in any way, although at times it was very difficult. Meanwhile, Sam, who was worried about her husband, wanted to come to him. As soon as the door opened, a gang of young men spat at the man. The hero decided that he would not pay attention to it. The manager decided to apologize for them right away, but Sam thought that there was no need to do this. He was sure that Parker was not to blame. As soon as Johnny noticed the fruits, he immediately wanted to try them. Meanwhile, in another place, a group of people were resting. The young man quite often discussed girls he would like to meet. His friend sitting next to him always supported him. Suddenly they heard a giant explosion that occurred not far from their house. Then they saw 2 unfamiliar young men who broke into their house. Nobody was going to talk to them calmly. Fortunately, the men's first attacks were unsuccessful. The man managed not only to repel these attacks, but also to deliver good blows in response. Noticing that they had seized the initiative, Johnny decided to sit down and try something tasty. In the beginning, it was very easy for Sema to fight against such an enemy, but later the situation began to deteriorate significantly, and he could no longer control such tension. With each blow, the atmosphere became more tense. The girls began to worry about their lives and thought that they had to leave. When he saw that the other comrade was just standing there, he started attacking him. Johnny was fully prepared for such attacks, so he easily blocked the first one. In response, he put up a shield that prevented the enemy from approaching him so easily. But before that, he activated special magic. But the opponent's arsenal was also quite powerful. The opponent was not going to give up, so he quickly decided to attack Johnny again. Now the young man's resistance was much more difficult to maintain, but the hero still did not give up. With each blow, the opponent wanted to find a weak spot to quickly hit the man with something. Taking advantage of the moment, he parried his attack and struck him back with his sword. But unfortunately, the enemy still survived such a heavy blow. He wanted them to end everything peacefully without any arguments. But now Johnny was not interested in this at all, and he wanted to finish the business he had just started. Therefore, with a big smile, the hero was already preparing a new attack, which was supposed to give some results. Another team noticed some activity on the top floor. Using his magic, the man launched a magic ball through which he could see something. Noticing two warriors there, they were quite surprised to see them. He easily recognized the first warrior because he was familiar with him. But the other one was not so easy to recognize, because he had a magic mask that covered his face. In his thoughts, the man realized that the tension at that moment was incredible. Meanwhile, the fighters continued to try to kill each other. A second later, Johnny was eaten by a giant monster that was very different from the others. Now their fight reached a new level and the participant was much stronger. Meanwhile, Sam successfully fought against his competitor, although there were times when he also had a hard time controlling his attacks. Taking advantage of the moment, he plunged a sharp sword into his body. The husband saw that after this blow, the competitor could no longer stand on his feet normally. The giant monster continued to fight against his opponent and a second later simply cut him down. He began to feel a strange magic that seemed to follow all his movements. And only then did the man realize that he had been completely exposed. No one was going to drag this event out, so the monster directed its attack at the man. When the magic disappeared, Johnny reappeared, and it turned out he owned this monster. Johnny realized that he no longer had full control over his magic. A second later, the opponents immediately began to attack, but fortunately it didn't help them because Sam was completely ready. Approaching the pagan, they wanted to ask him some questions. Meanwhile, the girls quickly ran away from this area while they had the chance. In another world, the owner who had the final relic in his body was waiting for his opponent. While he had some spare time, he decided to tell his story to his own workers. In fact, the man did not immediately become as powerful as everyone saw him. The people who worked for him listened to all this with displeasure. Meanwhile, Johnny didn't want to waste time and immediately started to launch the magic. He couldn't see where he needed to go because everything was in the fog. The system later gave him a good hint, with the help of which he knew how to get there. Filled with emotion, the hero immediately began to go where the system showed him. His magic was noticed by the man from whom the final relic was to be taken. With his strength, he was able to do this with ease. After this task, after analyzing his skills, he noticed that he was already at level 43. At first, the hero himself wanted to manually see who was left alive. The system showed him that the two warriors they were competing with were already dead. For such an act, Parker wanted to thank the heroes himself. The girl who always stood next to them was surprised by the boys' skills. After some time, they had to go to a new place. As soon as they saw the new area, they were immediately surprised. The whole range was at the highest level, and it didn't really suit Johnny. Grandfather always tried to be near them and control the situation. He continued to thank the young men for saving his city. He was pleased to hear this, but he emphasized that this did not need to be done. The heroes spent a lot of time together, so there was a lot to talk about. When they got tired of sitting in the house, they decided to go outside. After some time, the man received a call with not very good news. Then he was informed that a group of pagans had appeared somewhere again. The frightened manager decided to go to Johnny and ask how he felt. But at that moment he noticed a suitcase with things and did not understand where they wanted to go. Grandson Mike was ready for training and wanted to learn how to defend himself. So Grandpa decided to help with things and emphasized that Miko should not forget to balance work and rest. But in fact, the grandfather was very worried about the baby. And again his head began to burn because such a force of darkness was difficult to control. Once everyone arrived at the base, Johnny decided to introduce Michael to his team. The young people were actually very surprised because the place was huge. Johnny decided that he would train strong individuals and then he would be able to create his own alliance. Therefore, I introduced everyone to my assistant, who will be responsible for their training. The participants were a little surprised and began to whisper among themselves. Even the base of the 7 major guilds couldn't compare to the place they had ended up in. Later, the young man admitted that the owner of the base was his relative and lent him the use of it. Liz found it all very strange because she never knew that Johnny had such relatives. In order not to waste time, they decided to go to the training room and get started. But the guy also wanted to draw attention to the fact that it was Sam who completed the trials of the gods. And now he was their coach, but he was a little nervous because he was responsible for a lot. When Liz entered the training room first, she felt that the atmosphere was very oppressive. Each team member tried to show the best result. Watching what was happening during training, the young man was very impressed by everyone's abilities. As soon as the training was over, everyone was very tired. But Sam wanted to warn that starting from the next day, he would be conducting a slightly different training. Some of the participants simply began to fall asleep right on the table. Mike kept thinking about his dark powers, which were very strange that day. But the experiences of each of them were interrupted by the messages that began to arrive to Johnny. They were a bit shocked when they started reading everything because there was a lot of criticism, but then they decided that they could ignore such trifles and concentrate on training. When the hero was left alone, he remembered that he was the god of evil, but he really didn't want to be one of the 7 gods who worship the monsters of the secret kingdoms. On the contrary, he considered himself an omnipotent god of law who had a calm character and participated in games. It was God who ordered his helpers to fight the monsters so that they would not break into the world. But God was still unable to resist the enemy and fled. That is why they began to call him the god of evil. The flames of fire spread to all the followers of the god of law, who were destroyed. The god of law was peaceful before those events, and that is why he tried to stop the war. The young man knew that many believed in that legend, but among the creatures of darkness there were other stories. And since the god of the law was forced to flee, there were rumors that he disappeared into the kingdom without a trace. But before he died, he was still able to fight on his own against 11 gods. Johnny thought it was just incredible, but that was where the information ended. Now he was sure that he needed to continue leveling up. The experience points from the little monsters were good enough, but I wanted more. So he tried to find big demons to gain experience. From level 43, he managed to level up only to 47. But he couldn't even imagine that his weapon would definitely not be able to withstand this. The hero was a little upset since the level was not high and the weapon was worse than others. The spell also gave him confidence, but he was constantly worried about the lack of firepower. The monsters were very big, but Johnny could still handle them. But he decided to visit a neighboring city and stock up on new weapons just in case. The department manager immediately asked for help as the buyer turned out to be amazing. Meanwhile, Johnny was calmly drinking coffee until his peace was disturbed by a bunch of young men. The woman began to get a little nervous because Johnny wanted to buy up all the weapons that were available. It was very strange that the young man was so young and already had the top black card of the shopping center. At that moment, local rich people whom everyone was wary of appeared in the same department. The whole gang immediately approached Johnny while he was trying to choose a weapon. The young man tried to say hello and inform them that he was the one who was second on the state list of newcomers. But when he saw that it was Johnny in front of him, he simply went berserk. He once tried to collect all the information about Johnny, but he failed. It was a real humiliation for the young man not to be able to acquire a weapon. After all, Johnny was the first to buy and took everything that was available. All the young man's thoughts were only about the legend of the god of law, and he understood that it could be true. So he tried to reach level 60 to undergo the second transformation. The hero decided to use his spells anyway so as not to waste a lot of time. He understood that the great gods, instead of protecting humanity from monsters, were chasing after him. And now his task was to destroy all the demons that were constantly invading the human world. At that moment, he received a message from his comrade and understood that it was time to return. At this time, Johnny's entire team was working in the lab on the potion. But when their hero showed what he had gotten for them, their surprise knew no bounds. And we were talking about orange-quality skill books. While all attention was on Johnny, the girl decided to drink the potion that her brother managed to prepare. But Johnny forbade me to do this because it would make me an idiot. The whole team couldn't be more happy with those skills, since they were seeing them for the first time. But it was still necessary to return to training and master the following skills. Because the team will increase its strength, it will also be able to use orange books. As soon as everyone entered the training base, they saw Mr. Parker in front of them. He really wanted to just watch the team and see what they had achieved. Many of the participants could not even dream of meeting such an outstanding person in Parker. But Johnny was pleased that his grandfather decided to visit them and see the team's progress. The skills of these young people were simply irresistible, but a little unpolished. But he knew that learning from a secret hero as a teenager would give him unlimited prospects for the future. Now Mr. Parker asked permission to report what he had seen to the authorities, because this was the first time in his life that the man had seen real orange skills. Meanwhile, Johnny also did not waste time and wanted to choose a new profession again. In just 2 months, he was able to reach the entire 60th level. And there were a lot of things to deal with. And since he didn't have time for this, he decided to entrust this matter to his friend. The man couldn't believe that there were dozens of different purple skills in front of him. That's why Johnny made every effort to collect all these precious crystals. Meanwhile, in another kingdom, the second team was already reigning. The captain, as always, gave orders to his workers to do their job well. But a second later, one of them ran up and started talking about some hero. But the manager didn't believe such stories. After the man showed the special pass, he was very surprised. Now the hero was sure that an unusual fighter stood before him. Johnny offered his help because he was an experienced warrior. At first, they didn't know whether to trust him, and yet they decided to start collaborating with him. After this, the leader shouted for everyone to get ready for battle. Johnny, in turn, opened a portal through which he was able to enter a new area. In front of him, he saw a bridge and a sign on which nothing was written. Without thinking twice, he decided to jump into a large hole. At first, the man could see almost nothing, but when he spent more time there, he noticed his new rival. He was quite large in size and also held his own arsenal in his hands. This didn't influence the guy's decision in any way because he knew what he wanted. At first, the monster started talking to him politely and thought that Johnny should have saved him. And only after that I began to name all his strengths. After these stories, the guy was amazed because the monster called everything correctly. The young man was not sure that he had to save him. Looking at the monster, and he really had moments of pity, and his appearance was exhausted. At first they had no intention of fighting each other. Then Johnny wanted to know if there was any way to get the skill without killing the enemy. Unfortunately, he didn't have an answer to this question. When all the monster's assumptions were confirmed, Johnny was glad that he was not mistaken. But the young man did not understand why this was so important to him. Sitting down, they began to talk about everything they wanted like real friends. After they had discussed everything, the young man asked if the enemy wanted to do anything last. Then he politely said that he wanted to learn how to play games. But the guy couldn't help him with this because he always played only online. After a couple of minutes, it was time to start fighting them. Meanwhile, people continued to discuss important events. One of the warriors learned that in the kingdom where the young man was now, there were good skills. Some warriors wanted to get into this area and start fighting, but half of them began to insist that it was quite risky. After such conversations, many went over to the side of the man who did not want to go there. When the manager heard this, he immediately started shouting at them loudly. After all, when it came to him now, no one wanted to help him. But after such words, they suddenly became active and began to work with him. The team was now 100% ready to fight against their competitors. Johnny was also present in the room where people changed their abilities. He thought he now had much more power that he could use. Therefore, without thinking twice, I wanted to increase my level with the help of my amulet. There were a lot of people in the Lyceum where many warriors were trained. The new students wanted to meet someone so they knew who was on which team. But after a few minutes, they noticed a man who really stood out from everyone else. He had a much higher level and also a pleasant appearance. Suddenly, an unfamiliar bus arrived, which caught everyone's attention. A second later, the man everyone had been waiting for came out of it. Now his team was fully assembled because every member was ready. Many of them were worried about how they would pass the tests. After all, they noticed quite strong competitors. Without wasting time, the hero began to use special skills. The other team was the most scared because they were the leaders. Now they really had a good competitor who could take away their leadership. They also noticed a new student whom they had not seen before. When the shouting became too loud, the leader announced that everyone had calmed down. Registration of warriors for this event was due to begin soon. But the warrior reacted calmly to this because he knew that he would win. The tournament organizers talked a lot about what was supposed to happen. Johnny watched all this carefully and listened to the leaders. Quite often, the organizers communicated with each other to make reasonable decisions. Meanwhile, the hero went to register for the tournament. The tournament representatives immediately began to announce which teams there were. They also didn't forget to tell the participants about the rules that prevailed here. The first team was introduced very quickly, but they were the leaders, and a second later they found themselves in another kingdom, where there were competitors. The first enemies turned out to be not so difficult for them. Meanwhile, other teams were watching. They were amazed by such speed and realized that the team was already on another level. But it was not only this team that understood this, but also all the others who fought here. At the beginning, ordinary players thought they could prove themselves. That is why we decided to be the first to start fighting in the tournament. Ordinary people were stunned by such speed and did not know what to do now. The teams could really compete with them, and everyone watched calmly. But when an even bigger competitor appeared in front of them, this did not frighten the team at all. And then this giant monster fell and never rose again. Meanwhile, Liz was gathering all her teammates. Seeing his teacher, the student wanted to approach her. But before he could do this, a new girl approached him. She had a great desire to compete with them on the same team. The competitors continued to sit nearby and watch everything. They didn't like the idea of the team taking on a new player. The rest of the students did not waste time. Therefore, they went to the severe tests. But the management was furious because they were given two strong monsters. The director was very surprised by this news and worried about the team. Some participants thought that weaklings were not very welcome in this place. Johnny's team was already eager to show their abilities in a real fight. They found themselves in some pretty tough terrain, but they were up for the challenge. Having analyzed their strengths, they knew how to use them. Choosing the right skills turned out to be a very difficult task. Johnny knew there were many different skills that could help. What most appealed to them was the ability to restore strength. But each member of the team wanted to be heard because they had their own opinion. Liz approached the choice very carefully and sensibly, and analyzed everything herself. Johnny, who played a big role in this team, also decided to form his own opinion. And within a few minutes, the team was fully ready to fight. As soon as the battle began, ordinary people could not believe that they were seeing it with their own eyes. The other team leaders didn't expect Johnny and his team to choose this for the battle. After each blow, the competitors were even more surprised and did not know how this was possible. But their surprise did not stop the players who were already moving into the lead. The director immediately began to beg them to help somehow. The team decided to obey him after all and quickly rushed into battle. The competitors they saw really turned out to be big. With their magic, they quickly began to attack the leader, and after a few hits they saw success, which was not long in coming. After the test was over, Johnny thought it was the end. The people who were watching this were again stunned by such a fight. After the test, the team wanted to rest a little. Then all the warriors who took part immediately began to applaud them, and also the management, who were infinitely grateful for such an act. Then the fighters were told what place they occupied. But some did not hear information about themselves, so they decided to ask again. The team wanted to see their close relatives, so they went to the hotel. The worker happily decided to help them, but it turned out that they knew everything themselves. But as soon as they opened the door, they saw their best friends. But before that, the ordinary worker did not know that they were all friends with each other. People began to actively get to know each other. But the new guy in the company didn't expect to see 3 directors in front of him. Each of them greeted each other rudely and also told a little about themselves. After everyone had become acquainted, the leader believed that the fighters needed to rest a little. This idea was also supported by the tournament organizers, who were satisfied with this result. The next morning, as soon as Johnny woke up, he wanted to see his partners. Entering the room, he noticed that they had hardly slept all night. The hero wanted to know what was going on, but as it turned out, it was difficult for them to choose a university. The girls, in turn, did not experience any difficulties with this, because they immediately knew where they wanted to go. The guy saw how everyone was calling their relatives, but he had no one to call. So he decided to call the teacher, who immediately picked up the phone and was glad to hear from him. He told how he spent his time, as well as what happened in the tournament. Subsequently, people who wanted to take part in the competition began to actively gather on the street. The leader loudly announced that today they were supposed to go through the first stage of training. The girl was a little late, which is why she couldn't find which group she was in. The lady decided to approach the management and ask what to do. Then Johnny started waving his hand in time and showed where they were. When the team was fully assembled, they decided to go for the first test. It turned out to be very easy for them because the monsters were not strong. The young man decided to delve into his skills to know what to do, and his team at that moment calmly fought against all the monsters that stood in their way. Having finished such a fight, they were glad that they understood each other. Liz, in turn, wanted to personally thank him for such competent preparation. But their conversation was interrupted by a girl who said that the group where all the fighters were was starting to discuss something. After reading these messages, Johnny realized that something had happened to his teacher. And in another area, people started to panic a lot because the exit was blocked. And the level of monsters in that area increased sharply, and no one knew what it was connected with. The captain of the other team was cruel to his workers. They were also very exhausted by such strong monsters. He continued to stress that the workers should pull themselves together and go fight. A few minutes later, Johnny himself flew into their area. He immediately started asking what had happened. The team leader did not give a normal answer and also started to be rude. At that moment, the hero was very furious, so he decided to hit him hard. Within seconds, the leader's students began pointing arrows at Johnny. At that moment, his classmate quickly came running and asked them to stop for a bit. Returning his head, the hero noticed another command. The man spoke politely and also said that they wanted to help them. First, he wanted to know what the situation was at the front. Johnny couldn't give an exact answer because he wasn't in that area. After discussing the events for a bit, he decided that they needed to go to the portal. The workers standing next to him emphasized that the heroes could not have come. Then the leader of the other team showed his passport. And now they had no reason to keep heroes in this world. Having moved to another area, they began to analyze what was happening there. But all their skills dropped sharply by several %. Johnny knew his base stats were high, so he wasn't worried. Arriving in a new area, they wanted to hear answers to their question. The man continued to scream because he was afraid of these monsters. Meanwhile, his teacher was feeling very unwell. After all, in this area, there were monsters everywhere that did not allow them to pass. The ordinary workers no longer had the strength to fight any longer, and some of them suffered serious injuries that could not be easily cured. Some of them have already begun to lose hope that someone will ever save them from this place. And the other woman tried to help someone in this situation as quickly as possible. A second later, the wall that had protected them so well was broken through by monsters. They quickly began attacking everyone they saw at that moment. The students were very frightened by everything they had just seen. The little girl, who wanted to help her father so much, started screaming loudly. The monsters began to attack the man first because he was the closest to them. Without wasting any time, they simply turned around and started running away from them as fast as they could. Hiding behind a thick layer of ice, people thought they could wait out the attack. But turning their heads, they noticed Johnny, who was heading towards them with his team. Everyone who was in his group immediately began to actively help people. In the end, having counted how many people died, they counted about 20 people. Meanwhile, the girl quickly ran to her father, who was lying there and showed no signs of life. They didn't have time to rejoice at their victory when they immediately heard some kind of wild cry. Noticing the unfamiliar substance, one of the team immediately began to attack it. He was later very surprised to see that the monster had simply recovered with ease. Now the team had no choice but to simply fight. Johnny activated his skills and began to attack the monsters. But ordinary people wanted to find a way out of this situation. Noticing the bright light, they immediately began to run quickly towards it. But on their way, they simply noticed a monster that lured them into a trap. The hero asked people to step aside. He understood that only his skills could stop such a gigantic monster. His sword began to glow with blue magic, which was very important. He fought with such a giant with ease and never lost to him. Liz just stood to the side and watched it too, because she couldn't do anything. In the end, he still managed to defeat this hellish monster. As soon as everything was over, many doctors arrived at the scene to examine people. The leader of the other team informed Johnny that the mutation was now completely over. In the end, he wanted to somehow cheer up the teacher. And a second later, he gave her an incredibly powerful skill that began to restore her health and enhance her abilities. Mary thought this use might be wasteful, but she used it anyway. The guys understood that there was only a little bit left and they could return, but none of them expected to be met by reporters. It was a good thing that Johnny had lost his divine emblem before such a meeting. The master smiled as always and said that the hero who saved everyone was behind him. The reporters immediately pounced on Johnny with a bunch of questions and wanted to interview him. It was all new and unexpected for him, but he liked it. His comrades were sure that Johnny was a little nervous in front of the crowd, but he should be able to handle it. As soon as everything was over, the hero decided to ask his master for a day off. Once at the training camp, Johnny remembered his rescue skill. Since the ability to resurrect was the most important, it was also necessary to raise the world level. Meanwhile, some rather strange things were happening on the city streets. A young man who had disappeared 5 years ago suddenly reappeared and created chaos. Parker understood that the enemy's strength definitely exceeded the 5th level, but he was ready to figure it out. The young man was glad to see Mr. Parker, as he considered him his idol at school. But now he wanted to show the old man what he had achieved in all the years he had been gone. He was the demon's disciple, so he understood that he definitely shouldn't lose to the old man. The gentleman knew that he did not have time, and therefore it was necessary to hurry to resolve this issue. But it was clear that the guy's strength was not simple, and Parker felt that he was almost in shape. As the world was in a state of imbalance, the threat level continued to rise. Therefore, as soon as the man finished, he ordered that they clean up after him immediately. None of the assistants even thought that their master was so powerful. Having met with their assistant, they immediately decided to discuss the formulas for the potion. Sam tried to convey that he was ready to reveal all the formulas to the entire country. It was thanks to Johnny and his work that this could have become a feat that saved many people. So Parker became convinced that Johnny's elite potions could make a difference. They were both sure that their boss, Johnny, was merciful. The old man was ready to create a plan so that all of Johnny's efforts would not be in vain. But the head of the guild, who produced the same potion, was not happy that he had a competitor. They discovered that a high-grade drug was being sold on the black market. That's why they were sure that apart from them, only a secret boss could be doing this. But when a check was made, not a single elixir in their guild was missing. But the man was ready to warn everyone that the secret boss was ready to reveal all the formulas. That's why the guild was happy that they would now be able to reproduce high-quality elixirs. But they really didn't want their potion to fall into the wrong hands without their knowledge. Some men even thought that this was some kind of secret hero's plan to reveal the formulas. So they tried to find out if there was an information leak from their guild. The husband immediately assured everyone that if the matter was related to the boss, he would take responsibility. Meanwhile, Johnny even began to think that he needed to get used to giving interviews. And after he showed everyone his strength, there were no more rumors about him. The young man was pleased that he was now considered the master's assistant. Now the guild understood that the hero could leave their city, and then everything would return to its original state. But then they reported that the secret hero was ready to conduct training with them. So it was time to start preparing. Johnny's entire team was ready, but they couldn't figure out how the enemy had access to their information. The hero was determined to make every effort to find out who else might know his formulas. The black market has always been famous for its various potions, so you could find anything there. Two people came to the rather strange owner who wanted to buy some high-level potions, but they still didn't know who they were dealing with. A real demon was hiding under the outfit. But they were also looking for the master, who had also turned to the black market but never returned. This monster kidnapped people and then prepared them for its own needs. So the disappearance of two from the black market shouldn't have been a cause for concern. The monster instantly grabbed the man and woman with its claws and placed them in a special room. Now there were enough people and it was necessary to wait until the warriors woke up. Meanwhile, Sam tried to find the person who sold the potion at the market, but to no avail. He even had an assistant, but she was just as empty. Sam had to deal with this problem, otherwise he would be very embarrassed in front of his boss. Johnny tried to remain calm and kept waiting for information from his assistant. It was at these moments that the warrior demons appeared, and there were a lot of them. And from the very beginning they were in so-called nests, where they hatched. Johnny's assistant still managed to find that terrible place and inform the boss. Johnny was very surprised that there were monsters there that they had never seen before. They became parasites and took complete control of the actions and thoughts of their owner. The boys knew that these creatures were special, but they didn't understand how to deal with them. Because very soon a large number will be able to hatch. But the main thing was that it was very difficult to distinguish the normal ones from those who were parasites. It was precisely this kind of monster that entered the guild with terrible thoughts. It immediately filled two guild members without the possibility of dismissal. Johnny sensed that something was starting to happen, but he didn't fully understand the extent of the problem. He was very pleased with his team and did not expect such a result. After all, initially he simply planned to find friends for the training camp. And now there were a lot of people who wanted to be on Johnny's team. Meanwhile, the Parasite King infested two 5th-level experts to increase his strength. To do this, you could stop hiding in the dark. But Sam and his assistant were still trying to find a way to destroy the army of creatures. Johnny had explained to them earlier that all these freaks were weak one by one. But the more parasites there are in a group, the stronger each of them will be. Therefore, to destroy them, you need to have a divine item. The girl really didn't know what it was, but she wanted to make every effort to find it. The hero was sure that there was little time and something had to be decided. Having quickly gotten ready, he wanted to visit their headquarters and check everything. Johnny found himself all alone in front of a huge army of parasite warriors. It was immediately clear that their king was at their head. It was under his control that many people were, and they all became a haven for parasites. Parasites could exist with the host's body, and only a divine item could deprive them of this ability. The hero looked very carefully and kept thinking whether he could use his weapon against the king. The demon knew that the young man possessed incredible strength and wanted to take him into his army, but in reality he didn't know who he was dealing with. Although he began to acknowledge Johnny's strength, he reported that he was not so easy to kill. The hero was convinced that his ordinary weapon had no effect at all, so he decided to use the dark forbidden curse. The enemy was definitely not ready for this and did not know what to do now. The hero understood that the summoning spell was still forbidden, so he had to be careful. But everything went completely differently than the man imagined. A very small animal appeared in front of them, and everyone just laughed at it. The husband was lying on the ground and did not understand what was happening. He couldn't even control his body, and the little animal immediately began to surround everyone with its energy. Johnny was very surprised, but while there was still time, he needed to find out the truth right away. The beast began to devour the demon little by little, but he managed to tell something. As soon as the man penetrated the dungeon, the leader created a parasite out of him and made his way further. But Johnny was primarily interested in who was the hidden boss in the dungeon. From the very beginning, the man was very weak and could only hide in the black market. And when his strength increased, he hatched larvae and decided to fight the guild. But now he begged the beast not to eat the parasite that was in his body. But everything happened differently. At the guild meeting, everyone knew that they couldn't handle the parasitic demon without Johnny. That's why Parker immediately suggested leaving all this to the hero. After all, everyone understood that from the very beginning, Johnny was only on their side. If it weren't for Johnny, their entire guild would have been swallowed up by parasites and the world would have been completely destroyed. Parker wanted to thank the young man and invited him to a ceremony in his honor. He also announced that a company would be created to sell high-quality potions. Everything would have been fine, but the hero had to return to the camp and leave his new friend. Since he was not at all aggressive, the young man left him with Sam. Everyone at the camp was very happy to see Johnny. One girl immediately suggested trying her new dishes, which she had prepared herself. That's why it was inconvenient to refuse, and he agreed. She felt like Johnny was a big hero because everyone had heard about his accomplishments. But she also conducted various studies in the dungeon and even wanted to demonstrate them. But all the students were very worried because they were all waiting for their teacher who was not there. Johnny tried to calm them down, but for now he decided to continue the conversation with the girls. So in order not to waste time, they headed to the laboratory together. That's where all the interesting stuff happened, but they were upset that there was a lot of work. Meanwhile, the girl invited the young man to look at the strange thing. But to do this, it was necessary to go into the research room where everything took place. The whole team immediately noticed the stones in the workers' hands. The same crystal was on the hero's neck and immediately began to show energy fluctuations. The teacher said that they found it in the Valley of the Secret Kingdom. Johnny immediately wanted to go there himself and check everything out with his own eyes. Hearing such a proposal, she was only glad and immediately began to prepare. Meanwhile, Johnny couldn't stop admiring those stones and understood that the connection with the pendant was strong. As soon as they entered the cave, the teacher introduced the young man to her team. Johnny was very pleased to be among professionals, but their peace was interrupted by a huge monster, which the guy dealt with in one blow. The team was very happy that they now had such a defender. So now, without being distracted by anything, it was possible to continue working. But that's why the monsters and their adventures are not over yet. A team member immediately reported that he had managed to find something. They realized that these were traces of an old civilization that had been destroyed by monsters. The girl understood that if their world was occupied by monsters, then they too would come to an end. Meanwhile, Johnny felt his crystal begin to react again. He was very interested to see what was hidden in these depths. And when they turned their heads, they saw a magic circle that could summon an evil god. From the top of that platform came an unusual force, and it was on it that that ugly thing stood. The team realized that there were an incredible number of monsters. The young men were confident that their defenses could not be penetrated. But the hero, as always, knew that he could deal with the enemy on his own. As soon as the young men saw all this, they knew that they had great support. But it was also necessary to take into account that the demons had a very strong boss, and Johnny knew he had to be dealt with first. As soon as they found themselves in the secret kingdom, they felt that they were beginning to be thrown out of there. The pendant began to absorb the crystal's energy again, and the young man's thoughts were only about it. While they were all together, they decided to go and check everything out. A moment later, they noticed footprints that definitely did not belong to them. Johnny realized that the situation was becoming much more difficult, and so he ordered everyone to stick together. The girl, unfortunately, was sure that the guards did not see anything. This greatly complicated their work, but she noticed some funny tracks. Another team joined in and also expressed their opinion. They were sure that the monsters had used a special skill that gave them greater power. The partner who always went with Johnny couldn't believe it. Each member of the team expressed their opinion, but they never reached a common verdict. The leader did not know which side to be on because he had two opinions. The girl standing in front of him began to convince him again. A second later, all their attention was directed forward because they saw Liz. Before she had time to say anything, the leader of another team offered her a place in the group. He said that because of the parasite demon, their team became weaker and they wanted to have a strong warrior. The girl was convinced that she had not yet been so confident, and also had her own small team. All the main leaders of the group looked only at her and wanted to hear answers to their questions. When she returned, she noticed Johnny and wanted some help from him, but he was sure that it was the woman who had to make this decision herself. A second later, she emphasized that she was still ready to fight on their team. Her allies were surprised by this decision. At that moment, Johnny was a little scared because he heard a voice that was very familiar to him. He also continued to calmly watch Liz and rejoice at her decision. Meanwhile, in another area, people were discussing what they would do next. While they were busy with their business, the leader wanted to understand for himself where he heard this voice. In the workshop, he concluded that it was his amulet that gave the same voice. But before making a final decision, he wanted to talk to someone else. Johnny remembered the words of the monster he met in the dungeon. At that time, he emphasized that the core located near him was very valuable. He also could not lose it under any circumstances because it could turn out badly for him. Even such terrible words did not frighten the leader in any way. Meanwhile, the group of people continued to search for what they needed. Subsequently, they did not change any strange buildings or people at all. When the team started discussing something, they wanted Liz to participate too. The girl didn't count on this because she thought that she didn't play an important role. The hero decided to wash himself after a hard day at work. But I was very surprised when the water turned out to be very cold, so I quickly finished my grooming. The little ghost continued to fly after him and tell him about this world. He knew a lot, so Johnny found it interesting to listen to him. Each time he asked if it was comfortable for him to communicate with him. The guy liked that his friend treated him normally. Before leaving the house, he wanted to look at his skills and notice what had changed. But the ghost was sure that nothing would change in such a short time. The guy knew many legends about gods who played an important role in this world. But his friend did not always go with him and noticed that this was not at all the case. He began to talk about this world from a different perspective, because he knew a lot. After such stories, Johnny was a little afraid for his life. But after a few minutes, he was ready to fight against monsters and protect people. He was sure that his new comrade was supposed to help him in his battles. After a hard day, he wanted to think things through before he started competing. The young man began to convince him even more so that the hero would be confident of his victory. The ghost also said that the guy needed to have a new artifact because his skills were weak. Having heard such information, the hero quickly jumped out of bed and wanted to know where he could get it. But everything turned out to be not as simple as the guy thought, and this began to scare him. Although in reality, the monster just wanted to make Johnny a little nervous. The monster asked him to draw with his thoughts what he wanted to see. With this, he actually managed to achieve the required skills. But according to the monster, the preparations did not end there. After seeing his abilities on the screen, he was proclaimed because the attributes were twice as big. His partner asked him to calm down a little, since his skills were still at the orange level. The next morning, they quickly began to prepare for the tournament. Meanwhile, people were already fighting against giant monsters. But they had never seen such monsters before. Johnny came to them in time and defeated everyone he saw in this area. The leader of the other team was surprised by such power. Unfortunately, he reported that they now had their own team that was prepared for such fights. The man also noted that now in this kingdom there were other rules that had to be followed. After these stories, the hero did not quite understand what was going on. That's why I wanted to figure out what happened. He was sure that Johnny's lessons would teach him even more about how to hit correctly, although the student himself doubted this very much. The next day, when they were already at school, the teacher was telling the theory. The monster was surprised at how outdated the training system was. At first, he was convinced that they would be taught exactly what was needed. The hero did not always perceive the theory correctly, although at times it was really good. When classes were over, the hero went for a walk with the girl. On their way, they met a man whom they knew well. Subsequently, the acquaintance began to actively talk to them. But this made Johnny very wary because they hardly communicated at school. Subsequently, the conversation dragged on, and the man bowed to the hero and thanked him for everything he had done for him. He was very shocked by this act. But as it turned out, the friend didn't pass empty-handed. Seeing with his own eyes another fragment of the world's heart, he was stunned. The husband always remembered the days when he and the ghost talked over these fragments, and my partner talked about them with great enthusiasm. Having thanked him for this act, he now completely changed his thoughts about this man. Meanwhile, the girl continued to hone her skills. When her team returned to her, they saw that there was some kingdom far away. Everyone present did not expect such a find. Without wasting any time, they decided to go closer and see what was there. The girls began to discuss whether it was even possible to find such a place. But the ghost was sure that the heart fragment led them to that very place. As soon as they wanted to enter Wednesday, they were stopped by a security guard. He wanted to know the names of the heroes, as well as why they came here. When the man said that he knew perfectly well that they were warriors, they were proclaimed as such news. The worker placed great emphasis on the fact that they were keeping an eye on the small children. But the woman didn't like it because she was already an adult, but no one took her seriously. When they entered this place, they saw many heroes who looked like them. The team calmly looked at the large statue standing in the center of the city. After reading all the inscriptions, they were convinced that this city had previously been frequently attacked by monsters. One of their team heard a very bad aura and realized that something was wrong. It seemed to him that there was something written in front of him, but the inscription immediately disappeared. Having told this whole story, Johnny realized that something was about to happen. In a moment, everything they saw with their own eyes began to simply collapse, and people who were very similar to them began to transform. Johnny was convinced that everything he saw was just an illusion that did not lead to anything good. Feeling this aura with their own bodies, they began to fight against the monsters advancing on them. There really were a lot of monsters in this area, but the heroes began to put up quite strong resistance. At one point, the weapon with which one of them attacked his opponents completely broke. But fortunately, the bastard who wanted to attack him turned into ice. Then, in this difficult battle, the very monster that always helped Johnny joined in. The hero wanted to introduce his team to his comrade and for no one to be afraid of him. Since all these monsters were from a completely different world, Johnny's help would definitely not hurt. But the hero was very worried that his team might not be able to withstand such an opponent. So the strange helper was ready to first pacify all the demons. But the power that appeared before them surpassed even the orange skills. It seemed like quite a big spell. The statue girl was confident that her opponent's strength was nothing compared to her sword. But Johnny's assistant knew that he could definitely handle her. At some point, her strength became significantly slower. It now became clear that his weapon was the source of his power. Johnny's assistant decided to use the ice blade, and it turned out that his skill was much stronger than his magic weapon. It was a terrible sight for everyone. They couldn't even close their mouths. But she definitely wasn't going to give up and wanted to go all the way to the end. It seemed to her that no one around her understood the true horror of the god of death. The weapon absorbed all the assistant's energy, and now he could not stay. The girls couldn't believe that all the monsters around them just froze. And all this happened precisely because Johnny touched his enemy's weapon. And the demon woman was sure that as long as the weapon existed, she could not die. But when Johnny looked up, he saw something he shouldn't have. The demon couldn't believe it, because it couldn't happen at all. Now she had to admit that this place was a beautiful kingdom, and everyone who lived there fought with the monsters that broke into their home. At first everything worked out for them, but then something went wrong. Many of her team lost their sight, and the god chose only one young man for himself. Only with this skill the god was pleased. Therefore he rose to him. The woman was upset because now she had to work even harder, and the monsters that destroyed them became even more numerous around. So she decided to take advantage of her last hope. But the dark force behind this weapon still got its way. The woman admitted that she did not expect that the dark force would absorb her consciousness and turn the place into a kingdom. Suddenly, she saw the one whom God had chosen for himself. It was one of her team who promised to always be there but never helped. He looked very unhappy because Johnny had taken the very weapon that belonged to him. The woman immediately stood in the circle and asked for forgiveness. She thought that all her comrades and residents were devoted to her, but this was not so. The young man kept making fun of them, but he understood that Johnny didn't give up so easily. Meanwhile, the hero was trying to decide what to do with the woman, who was now ready for anything. He managed to turn him into a normal person, but it was only for a while. And so she had a chance to deal with her traitor, but then she had to disappear forever. The young man could not believe that it was she, the one he had betrayed, who stood before him. There was definitely no time for talking at that time, and the woman quickly began to act. But it seemed to him that she was under the influence of a dark force. All she was interested in was why he hadn't shown up when the monsters invaded them. All the time he tried to justify himself and wanted her to believe him. The young man tried with all his might to convince him not to accuse him, because all the time he wanted to find a world where he could consider himself the strongest. For the sake of his faith, he asked her not to leave him, but it was too late. It was painful for her to admit that the young man had forgotten about their people. So she was very grateful to Johnny and gave him the most valuable thing she had. As soon as Johnny got his hands on it, he now wanted to know where the heart of the whole world was. The guy decided that he needed to hide after all. But only one face remained in his memory, and that was Johnny. The woman understood that the traitor was from her city, but she wanted him to be free with her. The hero's team began to worry that the same thing could happen to them someday. But Johnny thought it was all just empty talk. Some team members felt that it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to fight the monsters. So they decided to get together and come up with a plan for the future. Liz immediately pointed out that Johnny had summoned a character from another world and decided that everyone should know, and also that all monsters have long since exceeded the level of their world, and the fact that they were all still alive was a real miracle. Although the secret kingdom once merged with reality and humanity suffered great losses. That's why Liz wanted to convince them that they definitely shouldn't give up on this case, but rather continue to protect it. The Lord was sure that they could win only thanks to Jana. The whole team immediately supported the words of Liz and the Lord, so it was necessary to prepare for battle. As soon as the conversation ended, everyone even regained their fighting spirit. Meanwhile, the young man found himself in a city where he wanted to find a storage facility for himself. He still found his most secret kingdom, but he didn't expect that he wasn't alone there. But he decided to declare himself its owner. Therefore, the young man immediately fell on the circle and wanted it to listen to his prayer. But the young man needed something completely different. He immediately showed the face of the one who needed to be found, and this was the first mission. The assistant, for the sake of his god, was ready to do absolutely anything and immediately agreed. But he had never met Johnny before. But the name God promised to return to his assistant his power, which was taken from him. But the young man was not so stupid, and also turned out to be Johnny's acquaintance. That's why he met with him right away and told him everything. Johnny was immediately concerned that God might realize he was being cheated on. And then everything could turn out not in their favor. So they had to be very careful. Johnny believed that his friend was their real benefactor and was grateful for such information. Now he knew for sure that he would fight until his last breath. As they discussed their events, they thought that a powerful god had once again stood in their way. The hero knew that he had a great advantage, so he would be able to defeat the enemy. But his partner decided to disappoint the student a little. After this conversation, he was no longer so confident in his victory. He knew that this god had a special energy that was present in different time zones. The ghost suggested that he make a special plan with which they could defeat him. After a while, they moved to Sam, who did not expect to see them. The reason was that their enemy had greater strength. Looking at the little animal, the warrior began to list their skills. The hero was amazed and heard such information. And even less did he expect that his animal, which was always next to him, also possessed some kind of power. Johnny always stayed positive and knew they had a chance. He suggested activating special skills first, and a second later he gave his comrade a share of magic, and he continued to play with the funny animal. Johnny didn't know the full history of this kingdom either, but that didn't scare him. As soon as he arrived in this world, he immediately knew that there were weak people in this world. He wanted to use his magic to destroy everything he saw in his path. Meanwhile, ordinary city residents lived according to their own long-standing rules. After some time, his partner arrived to him, who was very exhausted. He asked that this hero finish as soon as possible, but as it turned out, in reality this was only the beginning of his plans. For the worker climbing up to the top floor, he decided to reward him with a gift. After this, his skills increased almost threefold, and this amazed him. The monster and his army did not want to appear to any ordinary fighter. He stressed that they had to fight to the end, no matter what. But when the leader stood up with his sword, then the monster fell to his knees. The hero did not expect such a reaction and did not know how to react to it. The monster began to say that he easily lost to such a strong warrior. Johnny listened to his words with respect, but he still needed his skill book. The opponent began to say that if the guy hits him, nothing will fall out of him. But the young man didn't really believe this story and understood that something was wrong. Meanwhile, it was very difficult for the hero to make the right choice about what exactly he wanted to activate. While analyzing his skills, he saw many interesting things. But when I came to a better study of each of them, I was surprised. The first ability seemed very strange to him. That's why he didn't want to use it. But I never imagined myself as such a strong monster. The ghost was not always with him. He told everything about each skill in detail. They discussed for a long time and found it difficult to come to any common decision. The husband understood that he did not want to delay this, and a second later he firmly made a decision that could change his life. Although in reality the monster knew that the system had no fundamental influence on anything. When they arrived at another place, they saw many different monsters in front of them. The girl was a little scared because there were too many of them. The manager, in turn, continued to feel confident, despite everything. Noticing a whole army in front of him, he began to fight them, but a second later he was victorious. The girl continued to practice her mentoring skills and tell people about the opportunities. All the fighters who knew each other were present at that event. Johnny and the ghost listened to all this attentively. But there was another warrior at that meeting who was quite popular. After some time, the girl suggested taking a short break. All the warriors quickly went out into the corridor and began to look at each other. But one of them suggested that Johnny talk to him personally about one important matter. As it turned out, the man wanted to know if the young man knew how to bless the fighters. The guy wasn't going to argue with such assumptions, so he told the truth. The man began to tell his story and how it happened for him. He also emphasized that he was unable to do anything at all. The guy listened attentively to all these stories because he understood that something was wrong here. The ghost was not always near him. He also saw something bad. Meanwhile, in another kingdom, the rival continued to accumulate his power. The man's black spirit was always with him and told him what to do. He really didn't like Johnny's actions because they constantly confused him. When his friend did not come to tell the information, the man was very surprised. Unfortunately, they couldn't get what they wanted so much. But still, the man told something useful and what the opponent needed. He thought that the hero had some special artifacts with the help of which he had such power. But even this did not stop the monster because he already had his own plans. Looking out the window, they knew what their rivals had been up to for a long time. Johnny had everything under control, and he knew how to deal with such situations. He was also glad that he hadn't told the monster about his plans. But before they had time to discuss everything with the ghost, he was called to eat. Once in the dining room, they quickly chose the food they needed. Now the rivals thought if they were luring each other into a trap. His thoughts were only about their first meeting and how it was supposed to take place. Johnny thought the same way and was determined to fight his opponent. And the man who was constantly between them knew that this would be a battle of two gods. Johnny wanted to know his competitor's weak points so he could know where he could go. But the ghost could not help with this so easily since he himself was not aware of it. His main rival was not at all worried about their meeting. He knew that he was much stronger, so he was confident of his victory. Meanwhile, the team noticed a rather strong opponent. Then some warriors became wary of fighting against him. Johnny wanted to help somehow, but he knew he wouldn't be able to get to that battle in time. Feeling a surge of magic, he began to attack the team. Now the competitor was 100% sure that he could defeat the man, no matter what. But his team also did not stand still and began to resist. A second later, the enemy found himself in some strange place where he had never been before. Then he was met by Johnny, who had been waiting for their meeting since ancient times. This not only angered the opponent, but the hero again complicated his plans. Looking at his opponent, he knew that now there would be a hellish battle in which there would be only one winner. Long before this, he had been going through all the skills he had in order to prepare well. Now that his main goal was in front of him, he wanted to win as quickly as possible. He had no intention of reacting to any provocations. That's why he started using his powers. The first battle was successful for him, and he carried away the dark man who was constantly flying above the hero. But no one wanted to stop there. The leader was very furious about all these events in the other kingdom. One worker decided to calm him down, but it didn't lead to anything good. He couldn't understand how in another kingdom some ordinary boy could disturb him. A second later, he activated his skills and wanted to leave for another world, and discuss with other gods that this was happening at that moment. The husband's brother had finally recovered from a serious illness and was ready to do something. His family member immediately met him and then heard his side of the story and many questions. The young man did not hear all the answers. It didn't take long before man realized that something was starting to happen. And then they noticed the secret kingdom. But a moment later, one of them began to have a very severe headache. The first thing the man wanted to do was call Johnny and tell him all about it personally. The hero tried to speak to him as politely as possible, but did not forget who he was. After their personal conversation, the man realized that he had now established contact with Johnny, and he really liked this, because the young man was a rather popular warrior. All the teams gathered in one place at that moment. Johnny was there too, and his friends were standing next to him also fighting. They knew that sooner or later new gods had to enter this world. He sincerely thanked everyone who worked for him and was also his friend. Now everyone knew that the secret guest was Johnny. He knew well that when he absorbed the failure, he found new memories for himself. While everyone was solving their problems, horrors were happening in the city. So Parker had to pick up the phone and deal with urgent matters. Very quickly, the team found themselves on the battlefield, but they did not understand how to defeat the giant. No matter what magic the old man used, it was all in vain. He tried to call for help, because I saw that the enemy had a material with good resistance to magic. Everyone in the city was shocked by what was happening. Once Johnny got involved in the fight, everything immediately became clearer. The whole team dealt with the enemy quite skillfully. The husband even began to confess all his sins. He told about all the demons he was associated with. Johnny decided not to waste time and start acting. But the man really wanted to see how the baby would cope when he entered the secret kingdom. There were plenty of demons there, but the team was confident in their abilities. At some point, the demons decided that people were trying to get away from them. But Parker decided that the barrier between them was impossible to break. But as soon as the hero put his hand to this matter, all the demons were very surprised. No one expected this. As Johnny approached the tribal chief, he barely held on. But the demons knew that their boss was the strongest and never doubted him. But the orcs still had to show all the weapons they owned. After discussing all the details, they decided to sign a blood contract. But the hero understood that demons were demons, and he had to be very careful with them. At some point, the system reported that Johnny had become the god of monsters, which is what made them all start worshipping him. The hero was very surprised and even a little confused. So the demon suggested organizing a small event in his honor. Everyone was happy and did not deny themselves something tasty. But then something really confused Johnny and he became a little wary. His girlfriend at this time immediately felt that all her characteristics had increased, and all his weapons were ready to help Johnny. There was a voice constantly sounding in the hero's head, and he didn't know what to do with it. That is why the young man decided to turn to the system. But very soon it became clear that it was precisely that evil fire, one of the 7 demonic gods. Johnny was able to remember that he had once fought with him and even killed him. The young man had to remember a lot and make a rather important decision. When everyone turned to His Majesty, whom they considered the most important. But one star knew that it was she who had the power of a deity of one of the 7 evil gods. But only one god of law was able to absorb the demon of evil fire, and all the others lagged behind him. While Johnny was being poured tea, he was still thinking about his plan. Because a few days ago the entrance to the secret kingdom disappeared in a strange way. All kingdoms would go into hibernation and then start releasing more monsters. But the young people were confident in John, as he assured them that he would bring help. It seemed to them that the young man was influential and strong, and that they needed to listen to him. Meanwhile, an emergency signal sounded. A huge army of demons could break through to the civilian population in the blink of an eye. All these creatures couldn't wait to just tear people apart in their path. But it was Johnny and his assistant who knew that they were stronger and could easily resist such evil spirits. And then, together with your team, get a lot of experience and generous rewards. The man was confident that he would easily defeat all the monsters that were here. After a while, people really started to weaken. Many warriors had already been killed, and this gave the monster even more confidence. Johnny's team reacted calmly to this and did not worry. They knew what magic to use. The leader kept a special calm because he wanted to come up with some kind of plan. Meanwhile, his group stood stubbornly and did not allow the enemy to pass. Despite this resistance, the opponents still wanted to somehow break through the defense. After thinking for a long time, he realized that it was quite a large arena, and as it turned out, she was well suited to receive the desired reward. A moment later, the warriors began to activate their abilities individually. The girl paid special attention to this because she wanted to finish quickly. The army of monsters didn't pay any attention to it at all. Some of their warriors had a giant dinosaur that was not very powerful in size. Also, around them there was always an army consisting of a large number of ordinary dinosaurs. The first thing they did was to attack everyone they saw. The people standing nearby began to tremble with fear and confusion about what would happen next. Suddenly their attack stopped abruptly because they began to hear their god. The red ghost begged them to end this as soon as possible. But no one was going to listen to their leader at that moment. They saw before them a target that needed to be killed, and that was all that worried them, and nothing else. And then they noticed that their energy was starting to run out at a rapid rate. The hero continued to activate his skills and feel calm. Some of his team received good rewards for their battle. The ghost that was always with Johnny saw a strange yellow ball that she had never seen before. In fact, Johnny didn't understand what it meant either, but he wanted to find out as soon as possible. His main rivals at that moment were conceiving a special plan that needed to be carried out. After some time, the man also arrived in this area. No one knew about his arrival in this area, so they continued to implement their plan. The monsters knew how to properly build a structure in order to win, but before they could turn their heads, they saw Johnny in front of them. The fire spirit was very frightened and began to somehow control them, but all the plans that were built in his head, Johnny quickly destroyed with his magic. And now he couldn't believe that his warriors were completely dead and could not resist. The ghost continued to scream very loudly, but the leader rudely asked him to shut up. In another kingdom, the god could no longer control the magic that came from the dead warriors. He tried to direct all his strength to that place, but nothing yielded results. The girl quickly wanted to help him and gave him some hints, but this only made him even more angry, and then he asked her to shut up. Arriving in another place, the man began to test his skills to bring them to perfection. When he became sad, he decided to leave this area and find something more interesting. The young man who arrived in another world immediately began to study the area to find out who was here. And he also always saw a portal that gave him the ability to move in space. After some time, a monster approached him and asked if he needed any help. Without notifying anyone, the young man could have dealt with his problems himself. The monster accepted this with a smile on his face, but emphasized that if anything happened, Johnny could ask for help. Finding himself in a new area, the leader wanted to explore what was there. But before that, he activated a special ability that allowed him to improve his powers. They stood on the hill for a long time and looked at the royal castle, and they noticed many warriors standing there one after another. Activating his skills, Johnny began to walk between them. He was very lucky that the warriors were tall and simply did not notice him. Suddenly they saw a great monster holding his arsenal in his hand. It was very different from the others because it had different dimensions and was larger. They didn't want to get into trouble, so they behaved politely. And after some time, some other people began to join this kingdom. When they went outside, they noticed some warriors again. Johnny wanted to talk to them and find out where they got such an arsenal. Some people laughed at him, thinking that the man should know all this himself. The ghost was shocked by such stories. Some members of the group concluded that they were some newcomers. Johnny also needed to find out how he could get to the special test. After hearing this, one of them emphasized that he could have sent him on a test for payment. Later, the hero realized that he had no other choice. Therefore, he decided to pay them this money. After paying, they started walking towards the place where the test would begin. The monster emphasized several times that inexperienced people could easily get lost here. He continued to talk to the hero for a long time until he turned his back. After that, he was shocked because he no longer saw the hero who had just followed him. He became even more scared when he didn't notice his bag of money. Meanwhile, Johnny was already in another place and knew where he needed to go. His comrade was always near him and told him what to do. After some time, they finally reached the long-awaited library. But before they could do anything, some woman flew up to them. Reason decided to talk to her because he knew her well. But she was not going to trust strangers and began to attack them. After such treatment, Johnny's friend wanted to settle their relationship. So they realized that they needed to turn off the special skill. Subsequently, the woman was indeed very surprised and saw the man in question. She began to apologize for her actions because she really didn't know who they were. But when she noticed the spirit, she immediately began to attack him. After some time, the fight started again, and the comrade decided to tell the young man everything. Also, at those moments, he tried to somehow convince the woman that they were not at war. But she always remembered all the bad things the ghost did to her. Only after a few minutes did she begin to slow down. After this, their dialogue still didn't work out. The young man asked his comrade to move a little further away because he wanted to activate his power. The monsters that were nearby were simply stunned because they were supposed to be teleported. In another area, monsters were already set to fight against people. In fact, they had gathered specifically to meet Johnny and his ghost. The girl began to worry about this situation, but she couldn't do anything. The husband realized that they had failed to save her from this attack. He had another option on how to defeat them, but he never wanted to return to it, and now there was no other way out. A second later, a gigantic, strong wind began to blow, knocking everyone off their feet. But it didn't take long before Johnny received his long-awaited arsenal. The monster, in turn, continued to wait for his leader, who was supposed to arrive soon. As soon as he saw him, he immediately became happy and asked if there was anything he could do for him. At that moment, Johnny didn't need anything. He was a little disappointed because he couldn't take all the artifacts in his world. Even the ghost had never encountered this before, so he didn't know how to help his friend. But as soon as they turned their heads, they saw a valuable artifact in front of them. They were very glad that they were able to take away the most important things they needed. Now they have more confidence to fight further. Elsewhere, the monsters continued to apologize for her actions. The one standing next to them did not know whether they needed to be forgiven, but they kept asking, because they were very sorry for what they had done. Meanwhile, in another city, Johnny came to look at his room. With the help of a special key, he activated the new world he so wanted to get into. Then the girl was furious because it was the first time she encountered such dark magic. Noticing a bright glow, she realized that Johnny had come for her. But she was even more surprised when she noticed a giant monster and not a guy. The stranger spoke only of John and his abilities. He was convinced that there had to be some way to break the boy and his weapon. The girl didn't know how to react to this, so she just kept quiet and listened to everything. After hearing all these stories, she thought that the monster really was right somewhere. He suggested that they work together and explore the world where the young man was. Meanwhile, the comrades were in the library where they wanted to find a book. When the story turned to his relatives, the ghost began to cry loudly. Johnny didn't really understand him because he himself had found himself in this situation more than once. But he thought he had to go further to avoid losing this war. When he moved to the next level, he was no longer as surprised as before. The spirit was not always with him. He was happy for his teammate. At that moment, Johnny began to remember his old enemy crying. Then he wanted to understand why exactly the monster did this. But the only way to find the answer to this question was to come to another world. Once inside, he saw his main competitor. Now he was bigger in size and also had more strength. The army of ordinary ghosts was afraid to fight against such a monster. Their leader continued to stand confidently and thought that they would succeed. The ugly woman simply laughed at such assumptions and began pointing at herself again. The opponent was confident that he would defeat ordinary fighters. Then the leader of the ghosts also noticed that they had one good fighter. The enemy was not going to take these words seriously, knowing that he was the strongest. And a second later, a young man appeared whom no one expected to see. After his appearance, the opponent really began to fear him. He knew what kind of warrior he was. Without wasting any time, the hero began to activate his abilities. Subsequently, many blows began to fly at the opponent, which he was unable to parry. The ordinary fighters standing nearby always supported their new leader. After analyzing his abilities, he realized that they had increased to a pretty good level. Now he had his own plans that he wanted to implement. At that moment, an old friend of his called him and said that there were more people in the camp. The hero wanted to see it with his own eyes. That's why he flew to this area. When he saw many people around him, he realized that the camp had really changed. Noticing their old comrade, people began to quickly approach him. He happily communicated with everyone because he missed them. Now he was surrounded by many acquaintances who wanted to discuss something with him. But then one heroine quickly ran up to him. But she reported that something had started to happen in the city. The girl wanted to talk to him personally to discuss the details of the events. When they were alone, then she said that they were preparing a stone catastrophe for him. After hearing this, Johnny thought for a long time about what it could have been. Meanwhile, they brought to the manager what he had wanted for so long. There was also a chest next to him that he wanted to open, but the worker assured him that he did not know what was in it. But as soon as he did this, monsters began to fly out of it. The worker wanted to save him from the amazing monsters as quickly as possible, but unfortunately he could not resist such strong creatures that began to attack them. After some time he saw a man standing opposite him, and it seemed to him that they had seen each other before. Then the young man began to tell his story with great pleasure. As it turned out, he and the girl had been good classmates since childhood. After hearing this, the manager began to understand everything, and he shouted loudly. The husband wanted to be heard, but unfortunately no one came to help. When he didn't find what he came for, he decided to leave this place. The worker's throat hurt for a long time from the fact that the stranger had squeezed it so hard. After all these stories, Johnny didn't know what to do. The girl noticed that the monster was now much stronger than before. Johnny decided to call Sam and discuss all this with him. The comrade immediately said that he could come and help at any moment. And now the guy has hope to defeat the stranger who was attacking people. After the conversation, Sam began to prepare for a serious battle. In their room, they discussed all the important events. The thief's uncle began to worry that he might be killed. But his relative insisted that there was no such person who could do this. But he still had his own opinion, which he did not want to deviate from. After some time, the thief said that he had his own leader, and he in turn possessed incredible power to take away souls. Therefore, he was confident of his victory and saw no other way out. After these stories, his uncle began to worry about him even more. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a ringing telephone. The men looked at him for a long time and didn't know whether they should pick up the phone. They decided to just hang up and not take the phone. The man reminded them of what they had talked about and wanted to end their conversation. Then he began to list the possessions of his leader and what he could do. And after that, the uncle realized that he had nothing to worry about. A second later, they saw an unfamiliar man. Then the thief wanted to know who exactly was standing in front of him. When he saw Sam, he was immediately happy because he had not seen him in the country for a long time. The young man quickly approached, grabbed him by the throat, and began asking where the stone was. The man did not expect the warrior to be so cruel to him. But at that moment, Sam turned his head because he saw many amazing monsters. And a second later, they were faced with a much stronger enemy. When the monster noticed Sam, he wanted to know what the boy owned. The hero had no intention of responding to the stranger's words, so he started laughing out loud, knowing that he was stronger. But the guy continued to hold the man by the throat and squeeze it hard. Suddenly, the enemy noticed a small animal that was quickly approaching him. And a second later, the animal bit him very hard on the leg. When Sam's friend saw the opportunity, he immediately activated his magic. Then the main enemy did not expect this, so he began to scream loudly. He wanted to activate some of his abilities, but the animal blocked everything. The opponents began to panic because they had never encountered anything like this. Now no one doubted the strength of the partners who came with the thieves. The chief demon continued to kneel and apologize. Meanwhile, in another world, God continued to restore order. A team came to him who wanted to fight together. Then he began to tell them some information that the heroes would really need. The team in turn listened attentively, but sometimes asked their own questions, and they thought Johnny was a very strong opponent. But the demon was convinced that he would be able to defeat him no matter what. When God heard that there was indeed some way to defeat Johnny, he became very angry. The demon wanted to at least provide some arguments to prove that he was right. The chief continued to listen to him calmly because he knew that he was right. Now they began to discuss their plan of action against the guy. The girl stood quietly and watched this and did not know what to add. And Johnny was calmly at home and playing with his animal. When Sam came up, they needed to discuss their plans for the future. At that moment, a group of young people just looked at them and didn't know what to do. The ghost was not always nearby and also wanted to help with something, but Johnny was not in the mood. The young man knew that the rivals in their home must have known something. But when the monsters heard what the guy wanted to know, he was surprised. He didn't like his answer, so Sam started to look at him cruelly. At Johnny's request, he did not know how to help him because he was not qualified to do so. The guy didn't care because he knew that his opponent knew what he needed. The ghost also always stood nearby and calmly watched what would happen next. When he was offered normal conditions, the monster finally agreed to help. Now Johnny was confident that he would still be able to wake up one woman.